the meantime, we here are ready for the off and for the actual results with outside broadcast cameras at Guildford, where once again they are hoping to be the very first to take the honours for the first actual result of this election. We're also going to Stirling, where the Scottish National Party's hopes are high, and of course every Scottish patriot there can remember another famous victory in the vicinity of Bannockburn just over 600 years ago. And also to Bath in Somerset, where we'll be taking a particular interest in the fortunes of the newly converted Liberal Christopher Mayhew. And up in the northeast, we will have another man who followed his conscience. We shall be at Blyth to see if another former Labour MP, Eddie Milne, holds on to the seat that he won in February against the official Labour candidate there. This is an hour of greatest importance to our country. Our futures depend on it. But elections wouldn't be elections without a bit of the razzmatazz and even a bit of a gamble. So just to compare with how our own polls today are suggesting, let's see how the punters are behaving now just after 10 o'clock on election night. £1 million has been staked, apparently. Julian Wilson has some of the answers for us at William Hill's headquarters in southeast London.
Well, if you believe, as they do here, that money talks, there can only be one answer to this election, and that is a resounding win for Labour, because since the campaign started 3 weeks ago, they have been firm favourites. They opened up at 2-1 on. The largest bet of the election was struck at that price of £25,000. Since then, they've got shorter all the time. This morning, they were 4-1 on. The Conservatives opened at 6-4. They've always been on the drift. They're now 3-1, and the Liberals, they were 50-1 this morning, with no overall majority quoted at 6-4. But following the dramatic prediction at the top of the programme, now a change in the odds. Labour now 5-1 on, Conservatives 7-2 against. The Liberals go out to 66-1. That's the state of the parties here for the time being. Back to the election studio.
Well, Julian was saying Labour are 5-1 on. That means you have to put £5 down to win £1. And of course, what that means is that Labour are the clear favourites now all round. As we know well in the studio, though, pollsters and bookmakers can be wrong. And odds-on favourites can limp home in second place. Mr. Heath, for example, now remembers, I'm sure, all too well his position in February. On that night at this time, all the big money was on him. Well, David Dimbleby has been with Mr. Heath at his constituency in Sidcup in Kent.
This is the hall of the Chislehurst and Sidcup Grammar School, where in February last Mr. Heath, then Prime Minister, came to hear his own result and stood here under the balcony out of sight of the television cameras as his aides scurried backwards and forwards, bringing him the news of the general election result as a whole, and not a word of comfort. Tonight, after a campaign fought in quite a different style, he'll be back here as the electorate gives his verdict. Everyone who's watched him during this campaign has agreed, I think, that he's fought it with great confidence and determination, despite the evidence of the polls and despite doubts among members of his own party. Today at the constituency, he's been determinedly cheerful. He's at his agent's house now. He'll be here about 1:20 for his own result. His majority last time, 10,000. This time he has 4 opponents, Liberal, Labour, 2 independents. The Tories say that there's no doubt that he'll hold the seat. What will be interesting is what that result shows about not just how Mr. Heath understood the mood of the nation, but about how well he understood the mood of his own people here in Sidcup, a constituency which so closely resembles his own background. This is David Dimbleby at Sidcup.
Well, polls can say one thing, but it's actual results which matter. And to Mr. Wilson, now up in his constituency at Huyton in Lancashire on Merseyside, it's the results that he's going to be looking for. Michael Charlton is at Huyton.
And in a comprehensive school here at Huyton, where Mr. Wilson's poll will be declared. And for all of you who seek omens in these last hours of strain for everybody, particularly for the politicians themselves, I have to say that Mr. Wilson looks buoyantly confident here today.
Well, I'm afraid we have lost the picture from Huyton, but of course we hope to have it back there for Mr. Wilson's own count and for words from Michael Charlton, a report later on. I wonder if we can now go down to North Devon, where Mr. Jeremy Thorpe, of course, has his headquarters, and from which he has regularly addressed journalists and indeed the nation. So down there, David Lomax.
This is in fact his headquarters. This is the Queen's Hall in Barnstaple, where at about 1 o'clock this morning we'll know just how successful Mr. Jeremy Thorpe has been in defending his majority and retaining the seat he's held here in North Devon for the last 15 years. But throughout that time, it hasn't by any means been safe Liberal territory the whole time. In 1970, for instance, Mr Thorpe only just managed to scrape back with 369 votes. And this seemed to have shocked him so much that he and his workers pulled out all the stops, and last time, in the February election, he came back with a majority of 11,000 votes. Well, this seems to have made him much more confident in this campaign. He's been going outside the constituency, he's been touring everywhere by helicopter, and even privately his workers do admit, though, that they think that his majority might just be cut a little this time because of a new Conservative opponent, and also because he has a Labour component and the English National Party. Well, we'll know the result at about 1 o'clock this morning from the Queen's Hall, Barnstaple. This is David Lomax in Devon North.
And so far tonight, we can't give the Liberals much encouragement, although, of course, they could do well in individual constituencies. More of that in a moment. This is Mr Wilson's 5th campaign as leader of the Labour Party. And let's see if we can go back to Huyton and Michael Charlton.
I got as far as telling you, I think, how confident Mr Wilson has looked here this afternoon. Mr Wilson may not be a universally popular man, but his popularity visibly and unmistakably improves up here in the north, and particularly in Huyton. All the afternoon and this evening too, we've watched him being cheered by small groups of people wherever he's gone, as he's surged round his constituency with his red rosette and his buttonhole glowing like a traffic light, and I'm sure he's been cheered up by the reception he's had. We've watched him toss kids' balloons in the air for the photographers, and he's a man who leaves nothing to chance, though, because even up to a couple of hours ago, I was watching him exhorting children to go home and get their mothers and fathers to come out of the council estates here, which mostly make up the Huyton constituency, and get them to come out and vote. And all this is very much in contrast to how I remember him looking last time here in February, when I thought he was drawn and tired and anxious, and how it was with the approach of victory a couple of hours later, which is like artificial respiration to a politician. He was then soon miraculously aglow. And that's what he's looked like here today in Huyton, a man who believes and is fully confident that he's going to win. He's already broken Clement Attlee's record in office. Ahead of him lie more elusive records like those of Walpole and Mr Gladstone, who was with us for so long in the last century. And later on here tonight, we'll see Mr Wilson on the scaffold behind us, and we'll know his own result, and by then we should know the result of the election too.
There's a Michael Charlton indicator from Huyton. Well, I've no doubt that all three party leaders are very keenly watching the predictions of the polls taken today and seeing whether they match up with what has happened so far and with their own impressions of the campaign. Now, if you've just joined us, if you're just back from the pub, or perhaps you've been out voting at the very last minute and just got home, we can now give you some further details of our How Did You Vote poll taken for us by the Harris organisation in 135 constituencies today. We've broken this poll down into two sections. First, Great Britain as a whole. Secondly, Scotland alone. And these are the details of how you voted today. First of all, the Great Britain one. And there we have Labour with 43.5%, Conservative 33%, Liberal 18%, and the Scottish National Party and others, Welsh Nationalist Party and so on, 5.5%. Of course, that doesn't show up well on a Great Britain basis for the Scottish Nationalists. And if that were true, if that really is the result tonight and tomorrow, then Labour would have 380 seats, Conservatives down to 200. Liberals sticking at 15, that's just one more or so than they had, and others, these would be chiefly nationalists, but of course also Mr Powell's Ulster Unionist in Northern Ireland, 40 seats. But on that prediction, it would give Mr Wilson a clear overall majority. Well, now, David.
Well, firstly, I think those figures may actually be an underestimate in that they're based on the votes up to 8:15. We've still got later votes, and on the whole, people supporting the Labour Party vote later in the day, so there might actually be an increase if one's just sticking by the figures. On the other hand, the Scottish evidence isn't yet solid, and very unexpected things may happen in Scotland. Labour might lose quite a number of seats there to the Nationalists, which might cut the figure down by a bit. But I find it terribly difficult to conceive that Labour isn't in by a three-figure majority over all parties on these figures, and perhaps by a majority of 150 over the Conservatives. There are all those marginal seats that are going to be toppling over tonight. There may be a few that stand out. One other thing, the Liberals. The Liberals do seem to be holding up reasonably well. They are going to drop overall about 4%, but I think it's going to be very uneven, and they may be holding on rather well in their own seats. So they may gain up in seats, but may gain in seats even if they're down in votes.
Let's go now to see the results from our polls taken today in Scotland. This is the news for the Scottish Nationalists. Labour, 39.3%. Scottish Nationalists, clearly the second party, 36.3%. Conservatives down to 18.5%. And the Liberals and others scarcely featuring at 5.9%. And now Bill Miller in Glasgow. How do those figures strike you, given the other poll results in Scotland in the campaign so far?
Well, I think the most obvious thing to say about the Scottish results is there's a 14.5% swing from the Conservatives to the Nationalists. We had prepared here a little swingometer which shows you the seats which the Nationalists might expect to gain from the Conservatives. And the first news tonight is that we are already right off this swingometer. The Nationalists should gain Angus South, Ross and Cromarty, Galloway, Dumbarton, East Perthshire, Angus North and Mearns. They should also gain Dumfries and Fife East on the basis of that poll. It's almost unbelievable that the Nationalists could go up so much and that the Conservatives could go down so little. On the basis of that national poll, the Nationalists would in fact gain about 4 seats from the Labour Party as well. But we've got the special poll in Stirling, Falkirk and Grangemouth, and as you can see here, Stirling, Falkirk and Grangemouth, which we've called Stirling Boroughs, is the second most easy seat for the Nationalists to win from the Labour Party, and the special poll in Stirling suggests they're not going to do that. So it may be that Mr Wilson is not going to be deterred by any result in Scotland from getting his 318, and that the Nationalist push is going to be mainly at the expense of the Conservatives.
Well, Bill Miller, thank you very much. We'll be coming to you, of course, in the course of the night for your views on how the campaign is going in Scotland, and in particular, with the Conservatives apparently on those figures being wiped out in parts of Scotland, how the SNP's challenge to Labour is going to face up, given that apparent success for Labour in Stirling, Falkirk and Grangemouth. But these are all still early polls, and let's see how the betting is going on in the light of all this. Many millions of people are watching us, and a great many people are taking a particular interest in the bets that they've laid. So back to Julian Wilson. No, we have the figures here. As we were saying, it's 5 to 1 on Labour, and that means you put down £5 to get 1 back, if you like that kind of a bet. Conservatives 7 to 2, and the Liberals come in to 66 to 1. If you put 1 on, as the Liberals are going to get a majority, you get 66 back, if Mr Thorpe does much better than our polls are saying. Well now, punters, of course, are backing hunches. We think we're backing more scientifically in talking about the polls taken today, but we are all waiting for facts, facts which can only come live from the returning officers, just as soon as they have the full figures. And such money as I have is now on the returning officer at Guildford to be the very first, once more, with a declaration that triggers off what we believe will be the fastest election results service of any general election. Well, now in at the count at Guildford at the moment is Esther Ranson. How's it going on?
It seems to be going remarkably well, Alistair. I knew it was an achievement to get the results last February at 7 minutes past 11. I wasn't quite sure how they got it done. This is actually a difficult constituency. Some of the polling stations are as far as 20 miles away. The ballot boxes have to be driven through dark country lanes, and I gather that last February one presiding officer actually couldn't start his car and had to hitch a lift with his ballot box. But it's more than that. In fact, it's organisation and determination, because unfortunately with the bombs that went off on Saturday, they've had extra security checks, but they're still determined to make a very good show. And as you can see, there's skill down there, because those counters are recruited from banks, insurance agents, and they're extremely nimble and dexterous. They know exactly what they're doing. One thing, we have got a new returning officer, and he says that this election is not, from his point of view, going to be a race. He just wants the declaration here to be methodical, accurate, and first. That's Esther Ranson in Guildford.
Thank you. Well, now, from time to time during the next 24 hours, you will hear us refer to the results computer, and whatever the returning officers do, the speed with which the computer can screen the full results from your constituency. In the 56 counts like Guildford, where we have outside broadcast cameras, the computer speed is staggering, 5 to 6 seconds. Most of the other results of the 635 seats, of course, come to us by phone. That takes a little bit longer, sometimes as much as 45 seconds. And now Sue Lawley, who is a welcome addition to our election team, explains how this works. And to make it easier, she's nicknamed the computer ERIC, the Electronic Results Instant Computer.
This is where it all begins, with a telephone call from a local correspondent, maybe your local newspaper editor in any one of the constituencies. She's one of 8 telephonists taking the calls on special open lines. There's no time for hellos. The caller immediately states the identification number of the constituency, its name, and the name of the winning party.
562, Mid-Sussex, Conservative.
562. Another girl, called a runner, fetches the Mid-Sussex form from the files.
Renton Conservative, 27,317. Fraser, Labour, 7,993. Symes Schutzman, Liberal, 15,162.
Our result is now on its way to Eric's input editor. It's her job to see that Eric is fed the most important results first. She hands the Mid-Sussex form to one of her 6 girls, who presses a key to tell Eric she has result number 562 ready. He answers by offering her a result form on her special television set. She fills it in. If Eric is happy, and he's very fussy, that's to say the figures make sense, then he digests it. As you can see, within microseconds, Eric has processed our Mid-Sussex result. He's put the victorious candidate at the top of the list, he's worked out his majority, and, if required, he can calculate his percentage swing. It's now only a matter of seconds before that result appears on your screens at home. But first, it goes through the results editor. That's Tam Fry.
Yeah?
Eric has already been programmed to know which result should go out first. But if, for example, our Mid-Sussex result this time should be particularly interesting, the results editor will spot it, and by pressing this button, he can override Eric and make sure you see it within 45 seconds of its being declared. Of course, it's taken far longer than 45 seconds for me to describe the whole process. So, just as a matter of interest, I've got a stopwatch here, and once I press it, you can see for yourselves the system without my interruptions.
Well, that's how it works, and that's how it's going to work tonight and tomorrow. And if you find that impressive, you've only seen a part of the computer's role in this election. It's also programmed to analyze each result and extract the information about changes in voting patterns, which will enable Graham Pyatt and his team to predict the outcome. Well, now, Graham, your board is empty so far. How many results do you think you're going to need tonight in order to let you decide to risk your reputation in predicting the outcome of the election?
Well, that's not an easy question to answer. The polls, of course, do provide a basis for producing a forecast right from the beginning, but from this desk we don't work on the polls. We work on the actual hard results. And a lot depends on how much variation there is in the early results before we can decide when we're ready to make a prediction. I expect, however, it will take 10 or 20 results before we have something really concrete to offer.
Well, Graham, being properly cautious, but at 22 minutes past 10, we are forecasting on the polls that Mr. Wilson will have a clear overall majority. Well, now, Bob, how do you consider that forecast? How reliable do you expect it to be?
Well, in the past, the last 2 elections, our on-the-day poll, based upon interviewing people as they came out of the polling booth, and that's what we're talking about, has been extraordinarily accurate. So we must assume, other things being equal, that we're fairly near it now, but I wouldn't go to the stake on it. I would say this, however, that the prediction of perhaps 100 overall majority for Labour is based upon the prediction that Labour will get 44% of the vote. Now, here's the first irony. Labour lost the election of 1970 with 43% of the vote. They may tonight, because of the way the vote is divided between the parties, have a huge majority with the same vote, practically, of the nation that they lost with in 1970.
That says something about the electoral system. Well, I wonder if we will have changed our tune by 4 o'clock this morning or any time tomorrow. By 4 o'clock this morning, we're due to have 493 results home and dry in our computer memory bank down there. I hope you will stay with us through these early hours, suitably fortified, no doubt. You'll certainly be rather warmer than the crowds in Trafalgar Square, where Desmond Wilcox on election night is as much a part of the scene as Nelson and the Lions.
Oh, very funny, Alistair. And we've obviously been cast as the comedy subplot of the whole programme. Anyway, I don't know about stony-hearted Nelson up there, but for some of us in the damp, wet and cold, it feels as though we've never actually left Trafalgar Square since the last time. But 8 months ago here, we were then in the middle of a power crisis, you'll remember, and it was not only wet, but dark. And at least this time, the fountains and the buildings are lit up, and we can see how uncomfortable we are and how much more uncomfortable we might come. A small crowd has already started gathering here in the square in front of our giant television screen to watch the results and to watch the more comfortable people in the studio at home, probably at the end of polling day. But let's find out how some of them done. What's the difference between last election day and this one as far as you're concerned?
Well, the last election day I voted for the Labour Party. This election day I voted for the Conservatives.
Why?
Well, I believe that the Labour Party is in no condition to rule the country. It's disunited.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Desmond Wilcox, Trafalgar Square, at the beginning of a long evening. Back to Alistair Burnett.
Thank you, Desmond. Very good. And now from Trafalgar Square to the Outer Hebrides, from North Antrim to South Wales, Britain waits for the first actual result of this second election of 1974, warm or cold. It's time perhaps to sit back for a moment and ask ourselves just why we have to be here tonight. For some of the answers, we turn the clock back exactly 1 year. This week, a year ago, the Arab-Israeli war started, and it was the Arabs who brought into operation a new weapon, the one that was to influence the whole Western world, oil. They issued a now famous ultimatum: until the Israelis left Arab territory, the price of Arab oil would go up, supplies would go down. At home, the shortages quickly produced the saga of the lengthening petrol queue, and the threat of rationing loomed. And the increased price of oil gave a bad knock to Britain's already wobbly balance of payments. The increased oil prices did nothing at all for Mr. Heath's counter-inflation policy. Stage 2, which came in April 73, had put a ceiling on wage rises of £1 plus 4% and introduced the Price Commission to keep the lid on prices. And Stage 3, starting in November, just after the Middle East War, now allowed wages to rise by £2.50 a week, plus extra payments under various flexibility clauses. The Commission was to try to keep a tighter hold on prices. But the rules of the counter-inflation code were powerless against imported inflation. They plainly couldn't control the prices of anything, oil, food, raw materials, bought from abroad. And at the same time, Stage 3 came up against the threat inside the country that was to prove its downfall: the miners' overtime ban in support of their pay claim outside the pay code's limits. The energy crisis was further worsened with industrial action by the electrical power workers and by the train drivers. On December the 13th, Mr. Heath announced the steps that put him in direct confrontation with the miners and the trade union movement as a whole.
In the House of Commons this afternoon, I announced more severe restrictions on the use of electricity. You may already have heard the details of these. We are asking you to cut down to the absolute minimum the use of electricity for heating and for other purposes in your homes. We are limiting the use of electricity by almost all factories, shops and offices to 3 days a week.
If the miners went back to work tomorrow, normally working too much overtime, in our opinion, it would not solve the problems of Britain. The problems of Britain are there because they've relied on outside sources of energy for the industries that this country has to rely on. Don't blame it on the miners, blame it on the politicians who have not made the right decisions in the past.
And yet, Mr. Gormley, the Prime Minister himself is apparently saying clearly today that the mine workers must take a large part of the blame, whatever you say. Do you disagree with him so completely, or is there something...
Of course I disagree with him completely. I think he's trying to use the miners as a scapegoat, and I'm not being used as a scapegoat by Ted Heath or anybody else.
Once again, a year of go ended with an abrupt stop. Well, we will of course be continuing the saga of our country in the course of the past year when we can restore it. It is, I think, important to take the two general elections of 1974 together. The one that those events of the miners' strike, which led to the election at the end of February and the Conservative defeat, now followed by a period of Labour government, minority government, which Mr. Wilson wishes to change into a majority one tonight, so that the country has been able to decide, to make up its mind. And it is now having this second opportunity for only the second time in this century, and very shortly we shall know the answer. Well, now perhaps when the parliamentary historians do sit down to chronicle what happened in this year, they will have a lot to say about the role of third parties, the Liberals, the Scottish Nationalists. Now, how also did some of the independents, some of the mavericks get on? Men like Dick Taverne in Lincoln, Eddie Milne in Blyth, and who knows, perhaps tonight, Christopher Mayhew in Bath. For a flavour of the atmosphere in these constituencies tonight, let's go first to Lincoln and Philip Tibbenham.
And they're getting pretty used to the flavour here in the drill hall in Lincoln, because this is the fourth time in 20 months that the counters here have gone through this performance. The first time was for the renowned by-election when Dick Taverne broke with the local Labour Party. Then there was a local election. Of course, there was last February's election. And now this. And it doesn't mean by any means that the counting is over, because all three candidates here, obviously Dick Taverne himself, Margaret Jackson, the official Labour candidate, and Peter Moran, the Conservatives, are forecasting a very close-run thing, and it could be so close that we could easily have a recount. We shall know that about 12:15 or maybe 12:30. This is Philip Tibbenham in the drill hall in Lincoln.
Well, this campaign in Blyth has been even more bitter than the last one in February, with smear allegations and accusations flying back and forth between the supporters of both the official and the independent Labour candidates. As usual, there are many fascinating contests in the North East, but Blyth stands out. Everybody agrees with that because of Eddie Milne. After holding the seat for Labour for 14 years, he was disowned by the local party earlier in the year after a series of bitter rows and 2 inquiries by Transport House. Mr. Milne fought in February as an independent Labour candidate, his platform being his record over the past 14 years and his demand for a government inquiry into corruption in the North East. He kept his seat with a remarkable 6,000 majority, but all the predictions are that this is going to be a very, very close one. This is Jake Kelly in Blyth.
Well, there can surely be no more elegant setting for a count in this or any other election. We're in the 18th century Guildhall at Bath. The question here is whether the Labour candidate, the Liberal candidate who defected from Labour last July, Christopher Mayhew, can oust a Tory who's held the seat for 10 years. That's Sir Edward Brown. He's a bluff trade unionist. Or whether the split of votes will let in the Labour Party candidate, Malcolm Bishop, who's campaigned heavily on the subject of preservation in this city. Certainly there's been a high turnout, and Mr. Mayhew's supporters are extremely confident. There's even the possibility of a recount, and the returning officer is preparing for that possibility now. This is Julian Mounter in Bath.
And if this is indeed to be a night of success for Labour, I think there's little doubt that many people at the top of the Labour Party and party workers across the country will be watching those 3 seats to see how those 3 mavericks have also got on. Well, now, if readers of a lot of newspapers take the advice which the newspapers give them, which they very seldom do, however, if they do, they'll be discarding the old inbred party loyalties, and they will have put their cross today alongside the name of the local candidate whose policies and personality most impress them, like some of those independents. Michael Steed is with us, sitting behind me now, and he's going to watch some of the crucial details, particularly the evidence of tactical voting. Now, tactical voting is something we didn't really hear about until last February. Michael, what do you understand about it?
Well, we've always had the wasted vote argument. Liberal voters have always been told that they've got to opt for whichever they dislike least, the Conservative or Labour candidate. Now, last February, although Conservative and Labour were still the top 2 parties nationally, in nearly 200 seats, one of them dropped to 3rd place locally. And particularly in some of the seats where Labour was in 3rd place, Labour voters preferred to vote tactically. That is to say, they preferred to vote Liberal or Scottish Nationalist in Scotland to get a Conservative MP out, rather than vote for their own first preference, Labour. The result, Labour lost more deposits than the Liberals, Labour got fewer votes than the Conservatives, but Labour got more seats. It's the paradox again, as Bob was saying earlier, of the electoral system. And tonight I think that there will be at stake not just the question of who's going to be in Downing Street in residence on Saturday, but how our political system is working, how far the concept of majority government is standing up, how far the two-party system is standing up, not just nationally, but also locally in many constituencies. It's going to complicate things for us here predicting things tonight. Both the Scottish National Party and the Liberal Party could see their votes going up or their votes going down, and their seats going in the opposite direction because of this special phenomenon of tactical voting.
Now, Michael, how receptive do you think the party leaders are likely to be in this particular situation? After all, they spent a lot of time ignoring this kind of point.
Well, I think that if we get the sort of result that we were expecting on the polls tonight, the Conservatives are going to have another think about the electoral system. If Bob is right, Bob Mackenzie is right, and Labour wins a majority of seats overall, but comes in with fewer votes than, say, they got in 1970, then I think a lot of people will say, well, has the Labour Party a mandate? Is there a popular majority for the things that the Labour Party wants to do? We've always accepted that a party almost winning a majority of votes and an actual majority of seats didn't matter so much. But a party being defeated by 3 or 4 million in the popular vote, but getting a majority of seats, that really will open up the question of our electoral system.
Well, now we are still forecasting that Labour will win this general election, and the percentage share of the vote at 10 o'clock when the polls close, which has now reached us on our opinion poll taken today in these 135 constituencies across the country in England, give the following figures. Conservatives 37%, Labour 42.1%, Liberals 20%. And that is the news for Labour and the news for Mr. Heath at the moment. Now, our colleagues from the Harris Polling Organisation have come up also with they're going to come up with the results of polls taken elsewhere. And here is one now taken in the Scottish constituency of Stirling, Falkirk and Grangemouth. And this is the situation with Labour holding on to the seat, apparently, with 47.1%, the Scottish Nationalists taking 40.8%, the Conservatives down to 9.2%, and the Liberals 2.8%. That appears to us to be the state of play in Stirling at the moment. Now, Bill Miller in Glasgow, you are going to guide us through the psephology of Scotland tonight. How do you read that?
Well, it's a very good result indeed for Labour. In fact, Labour's gone up by 5%. The Nationalists have gone up by 6%. There's very, very little swing at all happening there. And so Stirling Boroughs, the second easiest seat to win, has not been won, and the swing is virtually zero, 1%, 0.5%. Consequently, it looks as if that seat is typical, Labour is going to hang on to its seats which are being pressed by the Nationalists, and the seats that are going to be lost are going to be Conservative seats. We may yet revise that verdict. It may be that there's something very special about Stirling, Falkirk and Grangemouth which we have not detected, possibly the fact that the BBC are doing a post-poll there. But on the basis of Stirling, Falkirk and Grangemouth, Labour is not going to lose very many seats to the Nationalists in Scotland.
But now, Bill, this does suggest to me here that the Conservatives are the people who are at risk, but this will keep the nationalist gains down very considerably, so that Mr. Wilson probably won't have to take a very serious decision about the Scottish national movement at the end of this election. Would you agree with that?
Alistair, I would think that Mr. Wilson has already taken very serious decisions about the Scottish Nationalists after the February election. He came out with a policy of a Scottish Assembly with very considerable powers for that Scottish Assembly when the Nationalists won 7 seats. If they win something like 13 or 14 seats, even if these other ones are mainly at the expense of the Conservatives, I think he may decide to give that Assembly rather more powers. One of the things you probably don't know down there is that on some of the Labour Party political broadcasts in Scotland, the powers proposed for the Scottish Assembly were considerably beyond those proposed in the Labour Party manifesto. And so Mr. Wilson has got 2 options. He can either go for the manifesto or he can go for his party political. I think if the Nationalists win 14 or 15 seats, he'll go for his party political.
Well, fine, and we'll see what the Secretary of State for Scotland, Mr. William Ross, who has been rather opposed to these devolutionary tactics, at least in the past, will say about that. But let's go now to Wales, where, of course, the Welsh Nationalists, Plaid Cymru, have many hopes as well to watch tonight. Peter Madgwick, do you think that Plaid Cymru is going to be encouraged by the SNP showing?
I think Labour will be encouraged by the Labour showing. The Nationalists, of course, in Wales are in a very different position from the SNP. In February, SNP took off, doubling its vote. Plaid Cymru here in Wales stayed very much the same. So it may not be very encouraging for them. But that said, Plaid Cymru here only need a puff of wind to make up the 3 votes deficit in Carmarthen, so that may well go their way. They could hold on to their other 2 seats. The rest of the seats in Wales in which they have a chance, Anglesey, Aberdare, Caerphilly, are really a bit beyond them, I would have thought.
Well, now, and another reminder of those figures and what they might mean to the Scottish nationalists and, just possibly at one remove, to the Welsh nationalists, with Labour holding that seat.
You notice those figures are a little below what they were before.
Well, we will wait, of course, with great interest to see whether the nationalist tide does flow in the way that the opinion polls suggested nationally in those areas, or whether, in fact, it will be that in local situations where Labour, picking up strength across the country, is able to hold the nationalists off, even where they had been most exposed. Well, now, as regular viewers of BBC's nightly campaign report in the past few weeks will know, the West Riding town of Keighley was chosen as the psephologist's dream town. It's a marginal place, it's a good mix of town and country, of blue and white-collar workers, and in the last 5 elections it's gone the way that the government has gone. So we've asked the people of Keighley how they voted, and we'll be hearing some of those figures in a moment. But in our Leeds studio, a number of the people of Keighley, already as well known as Eddie Waring, they become familiar faces, and David Jessel is talking to them.
5 weeks ago, when we first came to Keighley, we found Keighley a constituency of the uncommitted. Some 30% said they didn't know, or more likely being Yorkshire, wouldn't say. Anyway, over the last 3 weeks in our reports from Keighley, we've been trying to see how people have made up their minds and what sort of things have made their minds up for them, through the eyes of the people who actually matter, the people who vote here in Keighley. And one of the people who perhaps took... I think we just have to hand back now to London to see, in fact, how that Keighley poll went. Back to Alistair.
Well, we've just had the result of the Keighley poll has just reached us, so let's see it before we go back and talk to them. Labour holding the seat with 44.9%, the Conservatives 40.5%, remember this was a Conservative seat in 1970, Liberals 13.2%, just barely saving their deposit, others 1.4%. So that means that Labour will hold that seat, Bob Cryer holding the seat he won in February.
But only a small swing. I think that possibly we have slightly overstated the amount of the swing to the Labour Party, both from this Keighley result and the overall results. The figures we gave at the beginning were the figures to 8:15. The figures to 10 o'clock are going to show a smaller swing to Labour, enough to give them a very handsome overall majority, even if the Scottish Nationalists make more of a breakthrough in Scotland than seems likely. But it does seem possibly that the overall Labour majority would be under 100 on a final swing figure of 4.2% on our poll data.
I think Mr. Wilson himself would have been surprised if he'd got more than 100.
He might be glad at having less than 100.
Let's go now back to David Jessel in Leeds, having got that result.
And with respect to you down there, Bob Cryer has only actually held the seat once those votes have actually been counted. Anyway, I was saying that throughout these last 3 weeks, we've been seeing how people have made up their minds. And one particularly floating vote has been Kevin Howley, who some of you may have met in the last 2 films we had from Keighley, floating till absolutely the last moment, Kevin. And then I thought you made up your mind perhaps the day before yesterday. How did you, and what made you make up your mind?
I actually nearly changed my mind as I put the cross on the ballot paper, but I felt there was so much mudslinging between the major party leaders that it was very confusing as to which way to vote. So I decided in the end to vote for the best constituency man in Keighley, who I thought would be Bob Cryer. I decided he would make the best MP for the local constituency.
And so it seems that a lot of people in Keighley. But I think what a lot of people are wanting to know is how Kevin Heffernan, who many of you may have met throughout our films, Kevin Heffernan is a farmer, lives at 1,000 feet. It's very cold up there. I speak from personal experience. I think Kevin and his wife Sylvia rather thought the election would pass them by at 1,000 feet. But you were, again, floating till the very end. So tell us now, after all these visits we've made to your farm, how did you vote? Sylvia first, tell us how you voted.
Well, actually I voted Conservative. Because I thought if I voted Conservative it wouldn't let the Labour in. And I'm quite concerned about that, being a farmer's wife, owning land and property. So that's what I voted.
Kevin, you went Conservative too, did you?
Definitely, yeah.
Definitely.
I would have.
We've had out of you.
Let's put it this way then. I would have gone Liberal had there not been 10,000 votes between the Liberal vote and the Conservative vote. There's certainly not going to be that big a swing, and therefore I wanted to put my vote where it would block Labour.
Mabel Kershaw, I think throughout this campaign you've been a fairly firm Liberal.
Yes.
How impressed have you been by the campaign generally? Was there any moment at which you were thinking of wavering?
No, I'm being quite content with the position as it's been going along. I think that people with Kevin's mind, had they voted where their conscience really lied, then there would have been a swing to the Liberal, because so many people said they would vote Liberal if they didn't think it was a wasted vote. But it wouldn't have been a wasted vote had they voted Liberal. They've wasted it by voting where their heart wasn't.
Too late for the party political.
Too late, yes.
Frank
But
Carroll,
perhaps next time they'll learn.
Frank Carroll, you're a small industrialist. You own a small engineering works. We met you in the first two films. Conservative voter, obviously.
Without doubt.
And on the basis of our projected polls, how depressed do you feel tonight?
Well, I'll be more depressed if Cryer's in and the other fellow's out, and I'll be even more depressed still if a Labour government's in, because I don't think these people who've been canvassing Labour, they look all sensible people to me, and I can't believe that they can even imagine what it's going to be like under a Labour government.
George Lilly over here, you're president of the Keighley Labour Association, fairly confident, but I think at one stage actually you said to me that you didn't want Labour to get in with too strong a majority this time.
Yes, well, I did, in actual fact, say that. And my reasons for saying that, in actual fact, as we all know, the same thing happens with the Conservative Party with a fantastic majority. What I myself believe is this. When I talk about a big majority, I'm talking in the region of 50, 60, 70 seats. 30 or 40 to me would be just nice.
Because you're worried otherwise there might be splits?
Well, this is the point. The Conservative Party and the Labour Party all have splinter groups, and the splinter groups start putting their kind of politics forward, and you...
One very final word for the last moment, over to Brian Haggart, who's one of Keighley's largest employers in the constituency. In a word, how gloomy or happy or what do you feel?
Rather gloomy.
Back to London on that note.
Well, we'll hope to hear from the people of Keighley again when we give the actual result. As David Jessel reminded us, this is still just an opinion poll taken in Keighley today, but the record of such polls has been pretty good on previous days of general elections. Keighley was about 15th or so in that race last time, back in February, to give the results, so we should be hearing from it fairly early in the night. Well, now let's look at what the 10 o'clock count in our opinion poll today in 135 polling stations across Great Britain. Labour, 42.3% on this poll, Conservative, 34.4%, Liberals, 18.3%, and the Scottish Nationalists and others, 5%, although, of course, in Scotland, the Scottish Nationalists are doing rather better than that. And on certain assumptions and projections, that would mean a Labour majority of 100 over the Conservatives, Labour 340 seats, Conservative 240, Liberal 15, that's one more than they have today, and others, chiefly Scottish Nationalists and Ulster Unionists, 40. Well now, David, how do you consider this?
That's a Labour majority of 45 overall parties. Of course, if the post poll in Keighley was right, that was only about a 1.2% swing, which was just a little less than the Labour Party need for a clear majority. But on the whole, I'd rather believe a nationwide poll than one in a single constituency, because obviously you'll get a lot of variation in results. The Liberals were down by about 4% there. I think they're down about 4% nationally, allowing for their increase in number of candidates. But I still think it's pretty selective. One cannot make a simple projection from the total votes to the total seats now in the way that we used to back in the 1960s. So my fingers are crossed. I certainly think the odds point very strongly to a clear Labour majority, but I don't think any Conservative or any anti-Labour person should give up completely now and go and drown his sorrows. I think he's still got tense enthusiasm to see that the polls are wrong for another hour or so.
Well, it's a very good thing, in fact, if we were to come up with the result of an opinion poll immediately after 10 o'clock and told everybody to go to bed, what would actually happen to the electoral system? We'd just be running on some kind of opinion
They wouldn't
poll.
believe us, Alistair. They wouldn't believe us, even if we did.
Well, we'll see whether they should or not, and Bob, now in the battlefield.
Well, we've been talking about Keighley over here. It was a Labour constituency, and according to the poll, will be held by Labour. So that's a sign that this Labour territory that's at risk should stay in the Labour column, according to the Harris poll. Remember, it's not a prediction by me or by this programme. The Harris poll found, interviewing people as they came out of the polling stations, that that's the kind of thing likely to happen. But the Keighley swing was much smaller, in the order of 1.3 to Labour, which would cut into the Conservatives rather in this order. whereas the overall national swing, if you take the whole sampling of the whole country which was undertaken, would have produced something like this sort of swing with these seats going down, over to here or to here. In other words, these Conservative marginals, very narrowly held, places like Hemel Hempstead, Ipswich and so on, would certainly go on the Keighley swing of 1%, and if the national swing in this poll, and I think we might be making too much of it myself, if it were true nationally, then this line of constituencies would go down in a great sweep to Labour. And remember, however, the point is that the poll is reporting that Labour has about 42% of the vote, which is less than it got in the election of 1970, which they lost with 43% of the vote. But because of the split 3 ways or more, that's what's happening according to that on-the-day poll conducted by the Harris organization.
Well, that's the situation. We have the Harris poll and the 135 constituencies giving Labour a clear overall majority. We have the Harris poll taken up there in Stirling, showing Labour holding that seat against a strong Scottish national challenge. The Marplan poll in Keighley does, however, bring the Labour advance on the Conservatives down to a swing of just over 1%, which might, as Bob was saying, produce a very different result. Well, we'll only know the answer to this when we actually hear from the returning officers. And they're getting fairly busy around the country now, trying to get through, sift through those votes and see who is going to be first with the important news of the night. Well, my money is still on Guildford. After all, that's the form horse. And now, Esther Ranson, how are you getting on?
Well, Alistair, all I can say is that the system seems to be working so far. We had one anxious moment over one missing ballot box, but they've all been in for 10 minutes now, and the teams and the team leaders are getting a bit hot, running around a bit with their skips that they've borrowed from the post office to count the votes in. I can tell you that the turnout here is 72% as against 84% in February. And apart from that, we're all suspenseful, perspiring, and hoping to win this particular little race. Esther Ranson, Guildford.
Well, traditionally, here in the Salford Art Gallery, where Salford East and West are being counted, there's no problem for Labour. They've held both the seats more or less since the war with their 2 MPs, Frank Allon and Stanley Orme. What is perhaps interesting here is news I've just been handed about the turnout. Esther Ranson was talking about it a minute ago. The polls are for Salford West 64% and for Salford East 59%. And those are both about 10% down on last year. But I don't think either Mr. Allon or Mr. Orme will have to worry too much. This is Martin Young in Salford.
Well, here in the town hall in Cheltenham, the count is going ahead furiously as they strive to be among the leaders of the results horse race. It is being said that the new town clerk is not so keen on speed as his predecessors, but it doesn't look like that to me. There are 144 hand-picked people counting, many of them bank clerks. Of course, one factor that would knock Cheltenham out of the results race would be a recount, and that, according to the Liberals, who say that they can wipe out the Tory majority of 6,000, is not impossible. We've just got some figures on the size of the poll here. It's 75.1% compared to 81.4% in February. And in fact, it's about the same as it was in 1970. This is Julian Pettifer in Cheltenham.
Well, here in Wolverhampton, we'll be keeping you up to date on 2 West Midlands constituencies. Wolverhampton North East, where the incumbent is the flamboyant Labour left-winger Mrs Rennie Short, and Wolverhampton South West, which is Enoch Powell's old seat, which is still reasonably comfortably held by the Tories. Now, we're expecting a declaration here in about 50 minutes from now, so in the meantime, this is Brian Ash in Wolverhampton.
Well, here in Newcastle Central, Mr Edward Short has held the seat since 1951. And really, in previous elections, the main question has simply been whether Mr Short's majority would go up or down. The percentage turnout today, 58.5%, somewhat down on the February election. We hope to have a result for you somewhere around about 11:15. This is Bill Kerr-Elliott in Newcastle Central.
Now, David, the turnout is down in almost all these seats, ranging between about 8%, even up to 12%. What effect is that likely to have?
Well, it can further distort the result because it won't go down evenly. It'll go down more in the city centres where there's a much larger removal rate where it's not probably going to affect the results. It'll go down less, I think, in the rural areas. It isn't good news for Labour that it's down, and yet our overall vote figures, of course, do take account of the turnout. The one thing they don't take account of course, is the postal vote, which is very substantially up indeed on February, and where all my information suggests it's fairly heavily pro-Conservative. So that might put a damper on the thing. You might take even 1% off the Labour lead in the polls, make a 0.5% swing difference to the outcome by just allowing for the postal vote, which naturally isn't caught up by people telling on people outside the polling stations.
And that might be effective in some marginal seats.
That might be effective in some marginal seats. I mean, everything that's coming in is making me want to slightly pull down any indication we've given of a overwhelming Labour victory. It still looks like a comfortable Labour victory when we still haven't heard for a single result.
Well, as we watch and wait for that first single result and for some clarification of whether the polls are right or wrong, whether it's overwhelming or comfortable or whatever. Just along the corridor from us here, television commentators from 18 countries, from Norway to New Zealand, are spreading the word to an estimated audience of 400 million people. And this is what they're being told.
Es ist die zweite Unterhauswahl innerhalb von 8 Monaten. Und schon dieser Umstand deutet darauf hin, dass das Land eine politische Krise durchmacht. Im Februar hatte die damalige
Wilsons valg. Det var hans initiativ at udskrive valget. Det var hans balancekunst igennem 9 måneder som mindretalsregering
begonnen. Die BBC allerdings hofft, dass ihre Computer, und sie hat eine der größten Computereinheiten des Landes dafür eingeschaltet, dass ihre Computer
rezultati neće se znati po svoj prilici do sutrašnjeg podneva, jer će po svemu sudeći ishod ovih 10. po redu britanskih izbora posle rata biti tesan.
And in Keighley, just as a final footnote to the result of our poll there, 19% of the people asked in Keighley with sturdy Yorkshire independence refused to tell our interviewers. Well now, I think this is time that we had a word from Robin Day and his guest.
Well, we have with us 2 of the all-time political greats who've seen a large number of elections in their time. Lord Shinwell, who is 90 next week, and I calculate that he has lived through 25 general elections in all. And with him, Lord Boothby, a mere 74. Gentlemen, will you be surprised if there is, as David Butler suggests from our poll taken today, a comfortable Labour victory after this campaign, Lord Boothby?
No, I wouldn't be surprised. I don't think it'll be anything like 100 that's been suggested in some quarters.
But the
I
latest
think that there
prediction
will
is
be
about 45 on our poll.
Well, I think it's more or less about 30. But anyway, give them a comfortable majority for the next 5 years.
And are you surprised after this campaign?
No, at the beginning of the election, right at the start, I said possibly between 20 and 40, and I've never changed my mind. I judge by meeting. You mustn't always judge by what happens at meetings, but my impression was all the way through that we were going to win, but I don't believe we could do anything like what has been forecast.
What do you think of this campaign? It's been a very, very odd campaign, hasn't it?
Well, I think the remarkable feature of the campaign is the failure of Heath to put it across.
What do you think, Lord Boothby?
Well, I think it's been a boring campaign. I've been through many general elections.
All these percentages?
Yes, and I've won most of them myself during the time I was for 34 years in the House of Commons.
That was Aberdeen East,
East, yes.
That went the other way, didn't it?
Oh, yes, it went Scottish nationalist. Yes. But that's only because I left it.
I must say that I haven't found it boring at meetings. There's a remarkable enthusiasm. The sort of thing, you know, you get an ovation when you come in, and you get an ovation when you go out. Sometimes you wonder whether the ovation when you go out is because they're glad to get rid of you. But there's been remarkable enthusiasm.
If Labour does win comfortably, do you think this is the end of Edward Heath as a political leader? Lord Boothby?
Yes, I frankly do.
Who do you think will succeed?
The Conservative Party are ruthless.
Who do you think will succeed?
They won't tolerate failure. God knows. Can you suggest to me who could succeed him?
Well, I could suggest you a number of names, but perhaps it's a little premature. We can do it later in the evening. Mr. Whitelaw has been mentioned, of course.
Yeah, I don't think so.
What do you think? Do you think it's the end of Mr. Heath as a political
I think it's a great pity in a way that Carrington is in the Lords. He's the most able of the whole lot. He's got the flair. He's perhaps not as well informed as some of them, but he's got the flair, the political flair. He's a politician.
Of course, the House of Lords has made you rather impressed by Peers, hasn't it, Lord?
Oh, I'm not impressed.
Well, but all
by
the
them.
best politicians are in the House of Lords,
impressed
on
by
both
them.
sides.
Oh, no, I just accept it, just as I accept the pigeons in Trafalgar Square or the changing of the guard. It's one of the amenities.
Do you think the common market has played a lot of part in the campaign, anti-common market feeling?
I've had a lot of questions about that from people who say, how the hell should I vote at this election?
What did you tell them?
And I told them, well, I don't know which way I would vote. I would look at your candidates and vote for the man you think is the best, or the woman whom you think is the best, and then pray to God you get a clear-cut result.
I don't agree that the common market has been an issue. It's been raised at every meeting that I've attended. Last night at North Ealing, there was a packed meeting, and the issue, the predominant issue, was the common market and the question of a referendum.
Well, we may come back to you later, gentlemen. Thank you very much. Alistair?
And just before 11 o'clock, while all three party leaders are pondering the reality of their fate, which we hope to give them accurately shortly, we predict a Labour overall majority in this election. But, of course, we have not yet had any results, and we expect the first one coming up in about 10 or perhaps 12 minutes' time. In the meantime, Sue Lawley for the situation in the southeast.
Well, Alistair, there are 160 seats at stake in London and the South East, and that's about a quarter of the MPs in the House of Commons. But, of course, there's an enormous difference in the political complexions of the two parts of the area. Greater London had more Labour seats than Conservative last time, 50 to 42. And the South East, or home counties, was, of course, totally dominated by the Conservatives, who had 58 seats to Labour's 10. There were no Liberal MPs returned in the last election. Now, this is how London voted last time, and you can see straight away that, again, there's a big difference between inner London and the outer suburban ring around here. London's central core is a fairly solid block of Labour red. If you've got black and white sets, it's darker than the blue. And these constituencies should be sending some of Labour's most experienced campaigners back to Westminster tonight. There's Douglas Jay in Battersea North, Bob Mellish, Labour's chief whip in Bermondsey, and Peter Shaw in Stepney and Poplar. But outside the inner ring, the picture changes into a sort of patchwork quilt of red and blue, whose seats are divided between the two big parties, with the Conservatives slightly ahead. Some of the Conservatives' leading lights are dotted around here. There's Robert Carr, Shadow Chancellor of the Exchequer in Carshalton, Margaret Thatcher, one of the big guns of the campaign in Finchley, and, of course, Edward Heath himself in Sidcup. So how much can that picture change in the next few hours? Well, if we turn to what we've termed the battleground over here, we can see which are the seats most at risk. These are the seats with only small majorities, which the party managers will be watching anxiously through the night. Now, this blue block here is the Conservative territory most vulnerable to Labour. If there's a swing of just 1% to Labour, then the Tories would lose Ilford North, Brentford and Isleworth, and Upminster, and so on across the board. When we move into the Labour territory over here, the Conservatives need a slightly bigger swing before they begin to make an impression. So we start with 2%, which would cause Labour's first three marginals to fall: Putney, Ilford South, Paddington, and so on across the board. Now, there were no Liberals returned to Parliament in the February election, as I said, but they do have three hopes south of the river in Richmond, Orpington, Sutton and Cheam. We're moving now over to our map of the home counties, which is a solid Conservative wedge. As you can see, those darker blobs are the 10 Labour seats there. There are some well-known Conservative figures here: Norman St John Stevens in Chelmsford, Michael Heseltine in Henley, and Sir Geoffrey Howe in Surrey East. There are only 10 Labour seats here, but they include two well-known Labour ladies, Joan Lester in Eton and Slough, and of course Shirley Williams in Hertford and Stevenage. Looking at the battleground for the home counties over here, once again, Conservative territory is more vulnerable than Labour's. A 1% swing to Labour, and they would capture Rochester and Chatham, Hemel Hempstead and Oxford, and so on across the board. Again, the Conservatives need a greater swing to move into Labour territory. Just 2% would give them Luton East and Gravesend. Again, the Liberals have high hopes. They'll have a watchful eye on Newbury and some of these others down here. Now, finally, just here from the South East desk, 3 key personalities for you to watch as news comes in from the battlefront. Barney Hayhoe in Brentford and Isleworth. If he loses, then Labour could be on the way to an overall majority. Hugh Jenkins in Putney. If he's defeated, then Mr Heath and the Conservatives would be on the way back. And Alan Watson in Richmond. If he wins, then the Liberals' dream of a solid block of seats in Parliament could be turning into a reality. So this is certainly an interesting area, and we hope you'll stay with us. Alistair.
Well, I'm glad to see Alan Watson's face there, Sue. I don't know whether you're tipping him or not. What are you tipping for your first result?
Well, I think like everyone else, actually, Guildford. I mean, with Esther Ranson down there, how can they fail, Alistair? They must come in first, don't you think?
Well, I think so. My money has been on Guildford, although, of course, it's always nice to hear from Cheltenham and from the Salfords and Wolverhampton, and just possibly a little money on Newcastle upon Tyne Central, which is the seat of Mr Ted Short, Deputy Leader of the Labour Party, and they've only got very few votes to count there. It's one of the smallest seats in the country, so they might very well have a chance. David, do you think, is there something in getting your first result out, or has it ever given promotion to a town clerk?
I don't know. I'm sure it's a matter of local pride. It's one that Salford has a reputation from the beginning of the century. Cheltenham and Exeter have been in, but that's it. No, I don't think that. I think it is just a bit of local pride and local publicity.
Well, we'll wait and see, and of course we will be keeping you fully abreast of these events in these racing constituencies. And this is the map of the United Kingdom at the moment. This is where we're going to build up the changes in the regions and in the countries of the United Kingdom, and this is where the result of the election will be showing up in just a few hours' time. At the moment, the omens seem to be strongly for Labour, but let us go now to Cheltenham, one of the seats which could give us the first declaration, has done in the past. Julian Pettifer, how are you getting on?
Well, we've just heard that we should be getting the result through here, Alistair, in about 6 minutes, at about 10 minutes past 11, which I think might well make us first. That's the news that we have at the moment. Of course, this is traditionally a Tory seat. It's been Tory for as far back as I've been able to check, except for a brief period of 15 years when it was independent. But there are forces operating that might break that long tradition tonight. First, of course, the sitting member, Sir Douglas Dodds-Parkhurst, retired, and he had a lot of local support. And, of course, the Liberals did very well here in February. They forced Labour into 3rd place. And I've just been talking to the Labour candidate, and he is hoping that he may be able to make up that ground if in fact, Labour voting here follows what seems to be the national trend. He might be able to get back into 2nd place. At least that's what he's hoping for. Last time, the Liberals cut the Tory majority to 6,000 from nearly 9,000 over Labour in 1970. And the Liberals are fielding the same candidate today.
Well, now, Julian, you said 6 minutes a short while ago. Do you think that still holds up?
From what I can see down here, I don't see any signs of an immediate declaration, though, of course, the mayor, who is the returning officer, is down there. I don't see any signs of an immediate declaration. How are things going in Guildford?
Well, fine, let's go. Cheltenham, of course, is the home of National Hunt Racing, so they ought to know how to race. But let's try and see. Esther and Guildford, can you beat 6 minutes or 5 minutes now?
Well, there is a very special sign we have here. We will know when the result is going to be declared because the Chief Executive, the returning officer, Mr. Twyford, is going to put his jacket on. The first time Guildford came first, nationally, he's putting his jacket on. I don't think he's doing that to fool us. I think we're about to get the results of the Guildford. He's sitting down again. Well, as I was saying, the first time Guildford came first nationally, everyone was so excited that the then town clerk actually delivered the results in his shirt sleeves. And although in the heat of the moment everybody appreciated it, afterwards they felt that perhaps for decorum's sake he should have put his jacket on. And Mr. Twyford has said that that is going to be the sign when it's 1 or 2 minutes to go. Of course, no one actually expects a change of MP here, but it's just these figures do mean so much.
Esther, you don't have any other little signs that the returning officer can give us about who's won, pre-arranged in advance?
Certainly not, Alistair. That would be undemocratic.
Well, he seems to be sitting down, and of course we'll go there the moment there's sign of activity. Well, now let's have a look at, if you've just joined us, at the time now, just after 11 o'clock, and you may not have seen the result of the opinion polls which we've been taking today. First of all, this is the poll taken throughout Great Britain today, giving Labour 42%, the Conservatives 34.2%, Liberals 18.1%, and the Scottish National Party and others 5.7%, although, of course, that is very much higher indeed for the Scottish Nationalists in Scotland itself, where they get 36.5%. Well, now, Bob Mackenzie, how does this shape up to you?
Well, waiting in the wings has been the swingometer, without which no election would be complete. It's a child of a simpler day when the great battle was only between the two big parties, but let's see what it would say about the evidence we've been accumulating on our own on-the-day poll. First of all, remember it would take just over a 1% swing to Labour to give Labour the kind of lead over the Conservatives which would encompass Liberals and others who have 37 in the present House. We've been saying sort of 1.1% and so on. Now, interestingly enough, at Keighley, that was just the kind of swing that occurred, which would be enough to give Labour a simple overall majority and no more. The national swing, suggested by the Harris poll, and I think we might be plugging it more than it actually deserves at this stage, would give Labour a swing of over 4%, which would mean 120 seats over the Conservatives and overall perhaps 60, 70, 80 seats on that kind of swing. So that's the position. If the Harris on-the-day poll, and people may not understand what we mean by that again, as people come out of the polling booth, they're being asked, how did you vote? Which is a very different thing from asking in advance, how would you vote? So,
let's go now, must interrupt Bob, to go to Guildford and see if we have a result.
Well, the suspense is very difficult for everybody here. It looks to me as if they're just making one final check. I suppose Mr. Twyford, being a brand new returning officer, has to be absolutely sure. Everybody seems to be comparing notes. Yes, he is now getting to his feet. And here he comes. And we are the first.
I, Bertram Eric Twyford, being the acting returning officer for the Guildford constituency, hereby give notice that the total number of votes given for each candidate at the election was as follows. Christopher Jonathan Fox,
Liberal,
14,660. Robert William Harris,
Labour,
11,727. David Arthur Russell Howe,
Conservative,
25,564. David Howell has been duly elected to serve as a member for the said constituency.
David Howell is 38. He's an economic consultant, former Minister of State in Northern Ireland, the opposition spokesman, Treasury and Economic Affairs.
And here the Labour Party has made an advance. They're up 3.2% in their share of the vote. The Conservative share is about steady. The Liberals are down 3.5%. There's a straight switch between Liberal and Labour to Labour's advantage, but the turnout is down 8%, nearly 9% from last time. We'll have a lowered turnout, and if you did a swing between Conservative and Labour there, it's rather artificial when Labour comes third. That's a 1.5% swing, which is just about enough to give Labour a majority. They'll have to do better than that to get a comfortable majority.
By the same token, David, they've seen the Liberals off there, the Conservatives.
They've seen the Liberals off, but the Liberals have gone down more than quite a lot. The Liberals still are in second place. Labour is still pushed down into the third place they were pushed into in last February, but Liberals are not so much of a challenger now.
Would Guildford apply to some of the other seats around London, like Orpington?
Well, I think it must be very discouraging for the Liberals in the kind of Liberal best hopes. They haven't squeezed the Labour vote. Labour voters in Guildford haven't decided that the thing to do to push the Tories out is to vote Liberal, and that's what the Liberals are hoping for in all the areas of the south of England where they pushed up into second place last February.
Now let's see what the result in Cheltenham is going to be. Julian?
Is this working?
Well, this is the returning officer, the Mayor of Cheltenham,
right.
Mr. David Martin Jones.
Can I have quiet, please? I, David Martin Jones, being the acting returning officer for the constituency above mentioned of Cheltenham, hereby give notice that the total number of votes given for each candidate at the election was as follows, viz. Inglis Frederick Charles, Labour, 12,134. Irving Charles Graham, Conservative, 21,691. Roger Frederick Carson, Liberal, 13,237. And quiet please, quiet please, and that the undermentioned person has been duly elected to serve as member for the said constituency, Irving Charles Graham.
An almost exact repeat of last time's result. The Conservative share of the vote down up by 3.1%, the Liberals down by 3.2%, the Labour share exactly the same. The Liberals dropped back, though they still got second place, which they pushed up into, but no significant move between the major parties, between Conservative and Labour there. These two seats have not told us what's going to happen in the election.
They don't actually point, really, to
for the excellent work that they've put in. I want to thank everyone that's been involved in this hall, particularly, if I may say so, the police, who've had a very heavy day. I couldn't join them at the races.
Well, Charles Irving, he's a new Conservative MP, succeeded to the seat. He's a company director. He's a former mayor of Cheltenham, so of course he knows the drill on declaration times. And we should also say that the unsuccessful Liberal there, and it's quite significant that the Liberal vote is falling back here, where Liberals are second to the Conservatives. Mr. Roger, he postponed going on that Zaire River expedition in order to fight this seat. Well, he hasn't really been very successful. Bob, you've got a point.
I'd say on these two results, they don't fit at all the pattern of the Harris National Poll. The Conservatives are doing better than you'd expect from that national poll. The Liberals are doing markedly less well, I think. It's bad news for the Liberals in these two rather favourable territories for them. And in the case of the Labour Party, doing quite well in the first result in Cheltenham, not very well really. First result in Guildford, not very well really in Cheltenham. So I think it's much more wide open than we've been implying up to now.
It's awfully hard to judge the Labour vote on these seats because they're running third, aren't they? And
yeah.
It's not the same as where the marginals will swing over, if they're going to swing over, in London and the Midlands and elsewhere.
No, but on this evidence, it's more wide open than we might have implied from our own poll earlier.
Well, I think it's a good idea that we should keep it open a little longer, and of course it's a good idea that the poll should be put under this constant check by the actual electors, David. Now, how do you read it?
Well, I think that we must record that these two seats are of a particular type. They're comfortable, predominantly middle-class seats in which the Liberals did come up to second after only 120 seats of that character. A lot of people have been saying we're going to get more different results this time, more variation between areas, and I very much wait to see what happens in the Salfords, where we shall get our first Labour, characteristically Labour seats coming in, and Wolverhampton. Exeter, much more on the margin, a much more interesting one. We have at least, though, the evidence now that the Liberals are dropping back as was suggested, overall by about 4%, and it seems they've been dropping back in these seats, which are the sort of areas which were, you know, if they'd been getting 70 or 80 seats, they'd have been winning Cheltenham and getting quite near in Guildford. Well, they've dropped back in both of these.
Of course, they had to make a very big jump in order even to clobber the Tories in these 2 seats. And so perhaps Labour voters didn't think it worthwhile. Perhaps they thought this was the time to come out and vote for Mr. Wilson and not worry about the Liberals.
Yes, no, I think one wants to see the more super-marginals, the ones at the top of the Liberal tree, and see if there is different behaviour by Liberals, and by Labour voters indeed, in seats where the Liberals really have a chance. But so far, in both these seats, one should record the fact that the Conservative share of the vote has actually gone up. It went up by 3.1% in Cheltenham and up by 0.3% in Guildford.
So the Conservative voters are showing their teeth in defiance of the opinion polls which they read in their papers this morning, quite apart from our one tonight.
The Conservative voters in Cheltenham and Guildford are showing their teeth, yes.
Well, we'll see whether that stands up elsewhere in the country. Bob, are you expecting some better Liberal results?
Well, no, on this showing, it's not good news for the Liberals, because these are areas where they could expect to do well. It's better news for the Conservatives than the opinion polls would have suggested. It doesn't for a moment suggest they're going to win the election, but they're not being knocked out, as it were, the way some of the polls seem to be implying, with 12-point Labour leads and the rest. If that were really true, I think you'd get a much more pronounced Labour vote than you're getting in these figures.
Well, that is how we judge these first 2 results. There are, as we've been saying, peculiar seats in terms of Conservatives versus Labour, because Labour has come 3rd in both these seats, and therefore it has been much more the Conservative-Liberal battle, which is taking place almost everywhere south of the Thames. It's on the other battlefields north of the Thames, in the Midlands and the North West and Yorkshire, that the real fight between the 2 largest parties is going to happen. Now, Robin Day is entertaining again. Robin?
Well, I've got with me now 3 members of the House of Lords. Lord Whig, who, of course, was in Mr. Wilson's cabinet last time round, Lord Beaumont of the Liberals, and Lord Windlesham, leader of the Conservatives in the Lords, and a member of Mr. Heath's cabinet. Gentlemen, how do you read these first 2 results, insofar as you read them at all? They're not quite so bad for the Conservatives as our poll showed, Lord Windlesham, are they?
No, and this is what we have to see in the course of the evening, because swings measured across the whole country have to be related to the impact in individual constituencies, particularly in the marginal seats.
Have you steeled yourself to a Labour victory, though?
Well, the signs are not very encouraging at the moment, but if it doesn't upset Bernard Levin, Alistair Burnett too much to say...
Oh, they don't matter a damn. Don't bother about Alistair Burnett and Bernard Levin.
There's everything to play for.
They're not the future of the country. They're just parasites. Lord Beaumont, Liberals haven't done very well, have they?
Well, I think it is a question of we're going to have very, very different results for the Liberal Party depending upon the seats and depending upon our chances. And I think our average over the whole country is going to turn out with some very good results in some seats. But obviously we're not taking off seriously to win a major number of seats in the selection.
There's no signs either from our poll or these 2 results that you're smashing the 2-party system.
Well, I think we may begin to be doing it, and I think we may be piling up a very, very large number of votes over the whole country.
Lord Whig, are you surprised that Mr. Wilson looks like having a good majority, if that is so?
No, I thought when the elections started that he would win, but probably would not with an overall majority. I waited till last weekend before deciding whether to have a bet or not.
And did you?
No, I didn't, because
not even on Mr. Mercado's book?
No, at the weekend I was pretty sure that things were going his way, but the odds I could get were odds on, and I don't back odds on.
What do you think of the Conservative campaign, Lord Windlesham? Hasn't it, now that the election's over, can you not confess that quite a lot of Conservatives thought it was a rather odd campaign?
Well, it's been
I must go back, before you answer that question, to Alistair Burnett. I'm sorry.
And putting on one side these remarks about myself, whatever they think about Bernard Levin, let's go to Michael Charlton at Huyton. And Mr. Wilson arriving. Mr. Wilson there at his count.
Well, this is Mr. Wilson's 10th general election, and here he is arriving at the comprehensive school for the count in his Huyton constituency. 24 years he's been returned as member for Parliament here. a day in which he's shown himself, if not radiantly, but certainly buoyantly confident throughout, despite a bomb hoax earlier in the afternoon at one of the polling booths. Mrs. Wilson and Lady Falkender with him then. You can see her standing behind, walking in to the school now for the count. Mr. Wilson's got here a lot earlier this year. And that doesn't look like the face of a man, I think, who expects to be defeated in the general election this time. He's been followed by large crowds, and you can probably hear, at least I can, if you can't, the cheers of those in the building who've just realized that he is outside, and shortly he's going to be inside. He's talking here to his agent, Arthur Smith, the man who really takes charge of the constituency for him, while Mr. Wilson is in London. And Arthur's quite a figure up here, as Mr. Wilson always calls him. Lots of security on show here in Huyton today, and it appears to have been strengthened a little bit after the bomb threat this afternoon, which slowed down polling at one of the stations in the Huyton constituency for about half an hour before it was checked out. We expect the poll to be declared here in about another hour or so. And there won't be much more to see. Mr. Wilson will go down this corridor to a private room here before the declaration of the poll, and we'll come back and see the result and him later.
And Michael, when do you expect the result? Huyton isn't a late result, and I suppose Mr. Wilson has got a lot of thoughts about public duties if he is to continue as Prime Minister.
Well, we're not absolutely sure. We know it's going to be earlier this year, Alistair, than it was last time. Last time it was about 1 o'clock, so I would say somewhere before 1. Let's say another hour and a half from now.
Very good. We shall hope to hear from you then, Michael. And while we're waiting for more results to come in, let's go over back to Robin Day.
Lord Windlesham, as we were saying when Mr. Wilson interrupted us, don't you think that a lot of Conservatives were disappointed and bewildered by the nature of the Conservative campaign, that they seem to be low-key and so on?
Well, I think it's not just the Conservative campaign. I think the situation itself was confusing for many people. The Conservative campaign, led with great effectiveness and determination by Ted Heath, did stick to the central issue, how this country should handle the appalling problems of inflation,
yes,
unemployment,
I know what the
and everything
campaign,
else that
we know what the
with.
campaign was, and no doubt it was very determined, but don't you think a lot of Conservatives were bewildered by the nature of the campaign?
I don't think more Conservatives than members of any other party. I mean, the electorate as a whole does find itself, I think, perplexed by the nature of the crisis with which this country is confronted.
Lord Beaumont, were you puzzled by this campaign?
I was certainly puzzled by the Conservative campaign, because it seemed to me that they were producing no economic policies whatsoever. And Mr. Wilson was absolutely right to tear them apart in saying that they merely wanted a social contract of the same kind that he was producing without any hope of producing it.
Do you think, Mr. Heath, the Liberals were foolish to drop what they were saying in June, namely vote Liberal for a national coalition, and let Mr. Heath take that over?
No, I don't think that we were, because the only point in a national coalition is to get behind the right economic policies. A national coalition behind the wrong economic policies could be the death blow to democracy in this country.
Lord Whig, what's your verdict on this campaign as a campaign compared with other campaigns, as an example of the democratic process?
Well, I thought that the Conservative campaign was quite bewildering. Mr. Heath changed his objectives several times. And to that extent, I thought that by the weekend he was a sure loser. I thought the Liberals never really ever got hold of events, and I think the longer the campaign had gone on, the more Mr. Wilson would have won by.
Well, we'll see what happens, if that's right. Alistair?
And just to clear up a small point there for the many millions of people who may not read the Times newspaper and Bernard Levin, the reference was that in the last general election, I apparently said on a number of occasions that there was still all to play for. Mr. Levin took exception to this, although in fact it was true of what happened in the election. I haven't said it so far tonight because we still do believe that the Labour Party, on the strength of our polls so far and on the strength of the first two results, is going to be the party of government. Whether it is an overall and clear majority is now rather less certain. But we shall, of course, be filling out the details as the results come in. One of the next results which we expect to hear is from Salford. Let's go there with Martin Young.
Well, Alistair, this time last year, of course, Salford West had declared, but just to be awkward, this year, both of them look like declaring at the same time, and we think that's going to be in just 1 or 2 minutes. So it'll be very interesting to see which one, in fact, does declare first. I'm sure they'll be very awkward and both declare at the same time, except I believe the mayor is going to do both declarations, and he can't be in 2 places at once. So I think we'll stay now and see if the mayor is going to talk. He is, in fact, Councillor Harold Singleton, the mayor of the Metropolitan District of the city of Salford. He doesn't look very active down there now. I'm afraid we've nothing as exciting as the mayor putting his jacket on, as Esther Ranson had earlier. But I think we may be seeing some action soon. The mayor looks like he's clearing his throat. Is he going to come forward? I don't know.
Well, we saw the result just coming there from Torbay, where Sir Frederick Bennett has held the seat for the Conservatives, a majority of 12,000. It would have been a great surprise if he had lost it, of course, and the Liberals ran him second, Labour again in third place, as we expect them to do throughout the South.
A very small movement opinion there from last time. In fact, the Labour Party picks up 2% at the expense of the Liberals. The Conservative share is completely unchanged. The turnout is down 7%. This is fairly close to the other two we've had. It's another one of the same type of seat, the sort of place where the Liberals are doing quite well but not well enough to get in. The Liberals in second place. We've had 3 seats of the same type, and in each of them the Conservative share of the vote has stayed stationary or gone up. This isn't the makings of a colossal landslide against the Conservatives.
What we're really waiting for, of course, is the result from a seat like Salford, where it is really between Labour and Conservative and has always been so.
Yes. Well, we certainly are waiting for that. At the same time, I just made a point about the Conservatives. The Labour vote has gone up in 2 of these and stayed roughly stationary in the third. But these are really not giving us any trend. It is much more complicated than it used to be in this 3-party situation.
Well, Bob, do you have a view about that?
Well, no, I think David's almost got it right, as far as I'm concerned. I'd only say this, that I would expect some melting away of the Conservative vote on rather a larger scale than is occurring if there were going to be a landslide. I certainly think Labour remain favourites to win, but by a much narrower majority than perhaps was implied by the national poll we quoted at the beginning. It is interesting, if you look at these seats so far, take Guildford, the first one. Conservative vote share of the vote was absolutely static. The rock-solid Conservative vote remained where it was. The Liberals lost 3%, Labour got 3%. Then you turn to Cheltenham. There the Conservative vote went up 3%, share of the vote. Liberals down 3% again, consistently bad news for the Liberals. Labour vote static. And here again, the result we just had, Conservative share of the vote in Torbay static. And this suggests to me it's going to be a very much tougher fight than our original poll suggested.
Well, now, what about this point which some people call differential float-back? That when people do see that one party is running far behind in the polls, their instinct is to come out almost and vote for it.
Well, there's a little bit of evidence of that, but nothing like what some of the theorists of strategic or other voting have implied. I see small movements, but nothing like a great attempt by a third or fourth party to knock out the second or the first one involved. So I wouldn't say there's much in it yet so far of that sort.
Well, with these glimpses of the form so far, the 3 seats that we've had, all the Conservatives holding on to their seats and perhaps quite successfully. Let's go to Salford and see how Martin Young's getting on.
Well, as you see, the mayor now has the paper in his hand, and I'm sure that the declaration this time is imminent. He's about to step forward with it. As you've been saying in the London studio, of course, this will be a particularly interesting result because we haven't yet had a seat which Labour should hold. So let's see now what the results are going to be and what the Labour turnout has been. He's certainly worried about something there, but I think he's going to come forward any minute now, Alistair. I promise you.
It looks like Stan Orme there, standing beside him, and obviously he's back again, one would imagine.
Well, one would think so.
Salford West constituency. The votes cast at this election are as follows. Albert Edward Artston,
Liberal,
4,237. Stanley Orme,
Labour,
17,000. Please. Stanley Orme, 17,112. Geoffrey Nicholas Lewis Tillett.
Conservative.
8,540. And I declare that Stanley Orme is elected as a member for the Salford West constituency. Harold Singleton, a returning officer. Thank you.
Because there is, in fact, maybe two nations here. There is a 4.5% swing to Labour, all that the opinion poll suggested in this solid Labour seat. The Liberal share of the vote down 2%, 3%, the Conservatives down 3%, the Labour share up 6%. The solid working class part of England, our first sounding, is moving as much as the polls were suggesting.
Stan Orme, of course, has been MP here since 1964. He's pretty popular. He's been off as Minister of State in Northern Ireland since March when Labour got back. He's a staunch tribunite and an engineer, member of the AEUW. So Stan Orme back and opening Labour's score with a swing of over 4%. And David, you would reckon that if that swing held up in certain of these marginals in the North and in the Midlands, Mr Wilson is home and dry.
Oh, I think certainly Mr Wilson is home and dry. He needs a 2% swing. That was a 4% swing. But he isn't going to get 4% swings all over the place. As we've already seen, we've had 3 results which don't show any movement like that. We just need more evidence to see whether Salford or Torbay, Guildford and Cheltenham are representative of the average English constituency.
Let's see what the representatives of the average English betting audience are doing. Let's go now to the betting shop.
Well, whereas one's detected a certain amount of hedging of bets back in the studio, here the attitude is quite uncompromising. Labour are practically unbackable. They're 10 to 1 on. The big reaction of the evening was to the findings of the Harris poll. You may remember the odds were shortened then to 5 to 1 on Labour. That price was accommodated. They went to 7 to 1 on, 8 to 1 on, 10 to 1 on now Labour, which means it's almost impossible to win when you've paid the tax. 6 to 1 against the Conservatives, the Liberals are out to 200 to 1, and 4 to 1 against now, no overall majority. So no reaction at all to those early results here. The feeling is still that the Harris poll will prove to be right and that Labour will have a substantial majority.
Thank you, Julian, and of course we'll try and rush the evidence to you and put everybody in or out of their misery just as soon as we can. David?
Well, one thing's just struck me, that most people won't believe our forecast until seats actually change hands. And I've been looking at what happened last time, which is the best guide we have to when results will come in. And of the seats to come, Lincoln, which came in just after midnight last time, is up for grabs. It's very much a 3-way marginal between 3 parties. But leaving out Lincoln, which is obviously very much a special case, we come to Nelson and Cone at 12.23 before we come to a seat that will be likely to change hands even on the Salford swing.
Let's go now to another part of the country. Let's go right up to the northeast of England, to Tyneside, Newcastle on Tyne, Bill Kerr-Elliott.
Well, here in the Trinity Hall in Newcastle Central, we should really, on previous form, have had a result before now, but we've just heard that the Liberals have asked for a recount, so that is holding proceedings up somewhat here. The 3 candidates, Mr. Edward Short, the Labour candidate, Sheila Faith, Conservative, Andrew Ellis, Liberal candidate, all standing on the platform, waiting rather nervously. So that's it in Newcastle Central. There is a recount asked for by the Liberals. We'll come back to Alistair as soon as we have more information. This is Bill Kerr-Elliott in Newcastle Central.
Well, thanks. I think we would understand from that the Liberals probably are in danger of losing their deposit. Let's go now to Conservative Party headquarters, see how they're taking it there. Martin Beck.
Well, the situation here is that the Conservatives are not dismayed by your straw poll because, frankly, they don't believe it. It doesn't fit in from their own canvass returns what they've heard from their own constituencies throughout the day. It doesn't fit in with what they think is going to happen or their reading of the results so far. Instead, we've had a diversion going on beside me now, which is the arrival of some gentlemen and ladies from the Powell for Prime Minister campaign. Not a great many of them, but they are kicking off what may become a debate developing tomorrow about the future of the Conservative Party in the immediate post-election period. Their message is simple. It is Heath out, Powell in. And the Conservatives upstairs aren't paying a great deal of attention to it, but the demonstrators, like everyone here, is waiting for a great deal more hard evidence than we've had to now.
German economic domination.
And aren't we in exactly the right position to be dominated from abroad with such a sick economy at home?
And of course, Mr. Powell's own result from South Down doesn't come until tomorrow. However much they may be in favour of him, that small crowd in Smith Square. Well, we too are waiting for further and better particulars of the result of the general election, and we hope to get some more from Salford. We have had one result there. Let's have a look at Salford East. Here's the declaration there in the seat held by Frank Allorn, a left-wing member of the Labour Party's National Executive Committee. Here's Salford East now.
The Salford East constituency. The votes cast at this election are as follows. Frank Julian Allorn, 14,276. Alan Stuart Bell, 3,160. Stephen Reid Latimer, 6,440. And I declare that Frank Julian Allorn is elected as a member for the Salford East constituency. Signed, Harold Sinhington, returning officer.
And that is, of course, Frank Allorn safely back. It would seem to me to be a small swing to Labour in that seat.
3.3%. It's very similar to the other result from Salford, but a slightly smaller swing. The average now, we've got 2 Labour-held seats, and the average of the two is 3.8% swing. Here are the figures. 3.3% swing to Labour in Salford East, and the turnout down 7% as it was in the other seat. We've had a turnout down of 6 to 8% in every one of the 5 seats we've now heard from, and the swing nearly 4% in the 2 Labour-held seats, hardly any swing, and a collapse of the Liberal vote in the other seat. In fact, the Liberal vote has gone down in every seat, or has been disappointing in every seat that we've so far heard from.
Well, that seems to clear, perhaps, to a large extent, the Conservatives' worry about the second front coming at them from the south and the Liberal strength there. But let's have a word now with Michael Steed, whom we haven't heard from yet in this election. Michael?
Yes, we've had these 3 seats where the Liberals had second place. Now, in 2 of them, in Torbay and Guildford, the Liberal was so far behind that perhaps it wasn't reasonable to expect tactical voting. But Cheltenham was, in fact, 18th on the list of those seats where Liberals could have squeezed Labour and won. So I think we can now say that there aren't going to be more than perhaps half a dozen, at most 10 or 12 seats where the Liberals could do a squeeze on Labour and take a seat from the Tories. We're able to limit the number to that sort of order. And of course there are only 2 or at most 3 Labour-held seats where the Liberals have a chance.
And of course, Michael, if I could just put in a word for this now much maligned Harris National poll, it did suggest that the Liberals would end with about 15 seats, and that mightn't be out of line with what you've just said.
Yes, but there is something that's clearly gone wrong with the polls. We had breakdowns of the polls taken in the last few days of the campaign, and they showed that Labour was going up where it was in 3rd place as much as it was going up nationally. Now, either the polls as a whole are wrong and the Labour lead is nothing like it looked, or the Labour Party is going to do very differently in different parts of the country.
But on this regional effect, do you think that there can still be an opportunity for tactical voting? In which particular regions, what seats would you look for it now?
Well, I think there are half a dozen or so Conservative-held seats where the Conservative majority over Liberal is very narrow, and there Labour voters might decide to vote tactically.
This is Richmond,
Well, seats like Truro, Pudsey and Newbury, the ones right at the top of the list. And, of course, in Scotland, we may very well see Tory Conservative voters voting tactically to get Labour members out. Of course, voting for the SNP in that case.
Well, the SNP, of course, have had some hopeful news from the polls, but, of course, we are still waiting from the first actual result from Scotland to see whether they hold up. Now, Bob.
Well, I would think we ought to go to the state of the parties, if that's technically possible, because we're getting to get some results in the state of the parties board. If you look at this board, it'll come up in a moment, I think. We now have a position with Labour having 1, taken 2, the Conservatives 3, because they had good luck in the sense of some of their well-established seats coming in. No gains, losses anywhere. But now, the thing to watch all evening is the top right-hand corner. If Labour is to have an overall majority, it must have a net gain, a change, of 17 seats. And for a majority that would last a parliament, it ought to be 27 or 30 seats to last a parliament. Conservatives, if they were to form an overall majority government, need at least 21 or 22 and probably 30 or more in that second down on the right-hand top column. That's the thing to watch. When 17 comes up, the top corner, it must stay there for Labour to be an overall majority in the House of Commons. And Liberals, of course, no results in their seats yet, but they're not so far on the evidence, showing evidence, any indication of a real kind of swing of the kind that might have brought them in.
So it's still short of evidence, but we're hoping to get some quite soon from Wolverhampton. We heard briefly from Brian Ash earlier in the programme. I wonder, Brian, if you can give us any sort of time schedule now.
Well, we're expecting the result to be declared here, Alistair, in about 10 minutes, we think, but there's quite a sense of urgency here at the moment. There's been a great deal of moving about from various people. We've got the candidates already standing up on the platform, and we've had a great deal of running around the hall from what I can only describe as nubile young ladies carrying various bits of paper. There's no sign of anybody actually coming forward to declare immediately, but we are expecting a declaration very soon.
And of course it was Wolverhampton which provided one of the surprises of the last general election, the big swing from Conservative to Labour. That, after all, was Mr. Enoch Powell's stronghold, and when he said that he was going to vote Labour, it may have had an influence, or so some people thought, in Wolverhampton and in other parts of the West Midlands. Mr. Powell has said that he will vote Labour again, and he has already done so by a postal vote, although not this time, I believe, in Wolverhampton. Well, now, we've been giving some news, not very happy news, to Mr. Jeremy Thorpe and the Liberals so far tonight. Let's go down now to North Devon and David Lomax.
Well, I don't think Mr. Jeremy Thorpe himself has actually arrived here in the Queen's Hall, Barnstaple. In fact, when I came through to you earlier on, I said that we were expecting the result at about 1 o'clock. I'm not at all sure about that. It may well be a little bit later, because the last ballot box at 11:35 was still on the platform there. Yeah, the last ballot box was at 11:35, and they're still continuing the counting. This is David Lomax in Devon North.
Labour has taken 2 seats in Burnley and Lee, which is, of course, its own seats, and now we're waiting for the result of Mr. Ted Short's seat in Newcastle upon Tyne Central. Let's have the news.
And the news, Alistair, here is that we're just about ready, I think, for a declaration of result at long last. As you imagined, the hitch earlier on in the proceedings did come about when the Liberals, I think, saw the deposit somewhat in jeopardy. Here's the Lord Mayor of Newcastle, Mrs. Margaret Collins, the returning officer.
Parliamentary election, Newcastle upon Tyne Central constituency. I, the undersigned, being the acting returning officer for the constituency above mentioned, hereby give notice that the total number of votes given for each candidate at the election was as follows. Ellis, Andrew Stephen,
Liberal,
1,716. Faith Irene Sheila,
Conservative,
2,432. Short Edward Watson,
Labour,
10,546. And that the undermentioned person has been duly elected to serve as a member for the said constituency, Edward Watson Short.
The Lord President, the Leader of the House of Commons, Deputy Leader of the Labour Party since Roy Jenkins gave it up, former Secretary for Education and MP for this seat since 1951.
3.1% swing. 7% drop in the poll. It's one of the smallest electorates in the country. The Conservatives drop 8.9%. The Liberals are fighting for the first time.
For all the help he's given us tonight, and of course in all the mechanics of the election before it started. I'd also like to thank the staffs of the polling stations for the kindly and courteous way in which they've carried out their 15-hour stint today, often in rather cold, dingy rooms, and, of course, the police. As always, the Newcastle police have carried out their duties in a friendly, pleasant and courteous way. I'd like also to thank...
And so that's Mr. Edward Short giving his conventional vote of thanks to the returning officer. It is, of course, one of the smallest seats in the country, not too many votes to count there. But Mr. Short back again, and after all the carryings on in Tyneside and what has been said, no doubt he will regard that result as a clear vindication of his position and his behaviour. We now have some results, a series of results for you now. Here's the confirmation of Mr. Short's result, and you will notice there that the Labour majority, and you'll notice to the left of the Liberal a little line that means the Liberal has lost the deposit. And now Lee in Lancashire.
A lower swing there, only 2% swing to Labour there.
And Burnley, Mr. Dan Jones, one of the veterans now of the Labour Party.
In the 5 seats we've now heard from the Labour Party, 5 Labour seats, the average swing is just over 3%, which would give them a very comfortable victory indeed if it was repeated across the country. But they are all safe, really safe Labour seats, which one expects to go their way. We've got to wait quite a long time for confirmation for the behaviour of people in marginal seats.
Now, supposing the country were really to divide between North and South, as you were suggesting one moment there, David, in fact, there aren't very many marginal seats between Labour and Conservative in the South.
Well, there are quite a lot around London, quite a lot
yes, but I
in
mean,
the Midlands.
Really south of the Thames. London is a place.
No, Labour has virtually nothing at stake south of the Thames, only 5 or 6 seats.
So that some of the results which we've had from the South so far really have no bearing upon that.
On how many seats Labour is going to get. No, I mean, that certainly is true. It's interesting that a lot of the sort of private information one got was that the swing to Labour was less in the north of England than in the south. And this is a different picture from the private information. The private information isn't much good anyway. All the people I've been talking to have said if it wasn't for the polls, we wouldn't believe anything was happening at all. I mean, almost all the people on the Conservative and Liberal sides and most of the people on the Labour side have been really very negative about it, saying they don't know what's happening.
I mean, they didn't trust their own canvass results. I mean, is that...
No, they don't trust their own canvass results, and I think with fairly good reason.
Well, I suppose we have to go back now to asking the station master and the taxi driver, who used to stand Mr. Baldwin in good stead.
I'm afraid we shall go on using the polls, however much they may get discredited, because they still ask more people in a more systematic way than anyone else does.
Just a word now about the Liberals. We have seen them fighting here in Newcastle upon Tyne Central, where they didn't fight before. They lost a deposit, and therefore their national rating in the polls must be really very thinly spread indeed.
I think they're going to do very badly indeed in a lot of places. After all, they did scrape the bottom of the barrel this time in order to put up candidates virtually everywhere, in all but 4 seats in England and Scotland. And some of these seats, particularly in Scotland, I think they're going to do abysmally badly. If our post-poll in Stirling, Falkirk and Grange is right, they're going to get only 3% of the vote there. I think we are going to see a great many lost deposits for the Liberals, but so far their drops have been greater in the places where they had no hope.
But now the Liberal Party had a terrible slaughter when it tried to put up a lot of candidates in 1950. You don't anticipate anything like that?
No, I certainly don't anticipate anything like that. The national share of the vote they're expected to get certainly is much above that. Their base is much stronger. Then, of course, they did lose 325 deposits, I think it was, out of the 475 candidates they put up. It was an awful refrain all through the night. The Liberal candidate lost his deposit. We'll be saying it occasionally this time, but not nearly as often as in 1950.
And your reckoning would still be that where the Liberals hold seats, they still have a pretty good chance of keeping them?
I would have thought so. I mean, I think only 3 or 4 of their 14 seats are seriously at risk on tonight's evidence.
Let's have a word now. I think Robin Day is going to talk to Frank Alorn in Salford.
Mr. Alorn, good.
Yes?
Can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
Are you happy with your result?
Very happy with both the Salford results.
Do you think that you would have expected you got about a 3.3 swing to Labour? They
Yes.
talk a lot about swings down here in London.
Yes.
Does that matter much to you up there?
Well, I look at it this way. It's too early in the evening to predict the outcome. But I'm looking forward to a majority Labour government committed to more housing, social progress, peace, and a referendum on the common market. And I believe that that last item was Labour's trump card in this election.
Well, that's an interesting comment, and we'll be taking it up in the course of our interviews this evening. Thank you, Mr. Alorn. Alice?
Let's go now to Devon North. David Lomax. No. I think we just saw Mr. Thorpe there waiting, and no doubt he was smiling there. I think he still perhaps has some reason for hope in certain parts of the country, although it would appear from the results so far, which do also seem to be bearing out the national poll which we took today, the Liberals perhaps are not going to be cheering their heads off at the end. However, it's a long way to go until we do reach the end, and we will hope to be having a word with Mr. Thorpe very shortly. Of course, his seat was extremely marginal last time, and he spent much of his time in February fighting it. He came out with a very, very largely increased majority, and this time he's been able to go much more around the country, rallying the faithful, looking after as many of those 619 Liberal candidates as he could reach by hovercraft or helicopter in every particular way. Well, now, I think Robin is able now to talk to Ron Hayward at Labour Party headquarters.
Mr. Hayward, is this as good as you were expecting?
Yes, it's okay so far, but it's early yet, Robin. We'll have to wait and see, but at the moment we're feeling reasonably happy, you know.
Our prediction here, for what it is worth on the seats so far, is Labour with an overall majority of about 33. If that is so, does that strike you as good enough to do what Labour wants to do in the present crisis?
Oh, yes, 33 will carry out the All-of-Air manifesto. There was a time when we carried on with 3, you know. But I'd like a lot more, naturally. But 33, yes, I should be smiling at 33. I'll be laughing for everyone that comes afterwards.
What do you have to say about the Liberal performance, which appears to obviously disappointing to the Liberals? I know it doesn't matter very much to you, but it looks as if the two-party system is not being cracked on these results, is it?
Well, it matters very much to me. It was interesting to see, as I said some time ago, to see if the Liberal revival, so-called, was going to actually last, or whether it was a bubble that was going to burst. Now, we shan't know yet. And although you're doing all these swings on both channels, you know, swing-a-ding-ling, we shall have to wait a little while yet before we can really say if it's going to burst.
Mr. Hayward, I have to go, but we'll come back to you, no doubt.
Okay.
Alistair?
Okay.
And, of course, we leave Mr. Hayward with the kind of result that he likes to see. Keighley, the seat which tipped over to the Labour column in February, staying in Labour. We just had that flash for Keighley, so that is Bob Cryer back, and also, to a certain extent, however far people will let us say that this confirms the opinion poll taken in that seat today, it does seem to me to confirm the opinion poll taken in Keighley today. Anyhow, so Labour now pushing on ahead. We're getting some results in, but of course, if this had been February, it would have been the first seat changing hands. So far, none has, and we await to see whether there are any particular points or problems or uncertainties to develop in some of the marginal seats in those parts of the country where Labour does actually need to win seats in order to get this overall majority, which we are still predicting. Labour has held its own seat in Accrington, I see, and there is a recount going on in Nelson and Colne, one of the Conservative marginals in the northwest, in Lancashire. Nelson and Colne, a recount going on. Well, that might mean that Labour has taken it, or it might mean that the Conservatives are just hanging on.
What it does mean is that there's a much lower swing. If your recount means a majority of under 1,000, the Conservatives had a majority of 200 there. A recount does mean that there can't be a very big swing in the first marginal seat that we shall have heard from.
We're having a little bit of difficulty with ballot boxes in some parts of the country. In Manchester Central, apparently one has been lost. And in Northern Ireland, where, of course, they're not counting tonight because of the troubles, a police car carrying ballot boxes has been fired on outside Port Glenone in County Antrim. 12 shots aimed at the car, but they missed. No one was hurt. And so the count will no doubt go on with rather greater security in North Antrim later tomorrow. And with the news of Labour holding Wigan, David, sorry, I interrupted you there about Nelson and Colne.
Well, I was merely saying that it did mean that it indicates, if there is a recount and it's not something due to a Liberal trying to save his deposit or something, that it's a low swing in a marginal seat, and it adds to the tension on the overall figures we've got so far tonight. The Conservatives are level pegging, Labour's up about 3%, the Liberals are down about 3%. And this is as a 1.5% swing, but it's based on very different types of seat. We're waiting for marginals. Here, the first indication from a marginal is absolutely, apparently nip and tuck, a maybe a swing one way or the other.
The Liberal would have had to have dropped a lot in order to be in trouble with his deposit. He got over 22%.
Yeah, it was a very good seat for the Liberals at the last election, and they had some hopes of making some sort of breakthrough there. They're only 14–15% behind the winners. But I don't suppose it's that on tonight's figures. I think it just must be a close Labour-Conservative race, and it can't imply any vast swing to Labour.
A very tough fight, of course, some years ago when the seat was held by Sidney Silverman. It really was Silverman country, and we wouldn't have supposed the Conservatives could have done very much at all.
It was a solid Labour seat from 1945 to 1935 to 1970, 1968.
Of course, its character's been changing. It was weaving and so on, but now it's much more light engineering, and there may also be, I suppose, some commuting going there. Anyway, we wait for the actual confirmation of a result in Nelson and Cone, a recount going on there, and that could mean very serious business indeed. If the Conservatives were able to hang on to it, then I should think a lot of people would be smiling around Smith Square. But this is one that Mr. Wilson needs to take if his swing is really going to hold up. Well, this is the time of the night when we've had the early excitements.
There's a 1.1% swing to Labour in Wigan. That's much the lowest swing in a safe seat, but it is a safe seat. Also, oddly enough, the turnout has held up, only 2% down from last time, when almost every other seat we've heard from has been 6 or 7% down. I don't think you draw a great deal from such a rock-solid seat, but the swing is much smaller than elsewhere. And here is the result from Keighley, and you get a 2.6% swing to Labour, quite a big swing. It in fact is rather a nice confirmation of the post poll done by Marplan. And now I believe something is happening at Wolverhampton. Here we're over at Wolverhampton for the declaration.
Is about to declare the result of the elections in these two constituencies. He will give the candidates' names in alphabetical order, state the number of votes which they have polled, and will then declare the name of the candidate who has been elected, first for the North East and then for the South West constituency.
Ladies and gentlemen, as returning officer for the constituency of Wolverhampton North East, I declare that the total number of votes given for each candidate at this election is as follows. Philip Warren Hawksley, 11,135. John Frederick Porter,
Liberal,
7,156. Rennie Short, 25,000. $788. Anthony Davis Canvitt Webster, 1,928. And I declare that Rennie Short is duly elected as Member of Parliament for this constituency.
A 3% swing there. 2.9% swing to Labour in our first seat from the Midlands.
For Margaret Merritt Jackson, 14,698 votes. For Peter Miles Moran, Conservative, 11,223 votes. For Dick Taverne, 13,000.
So Dick Taverne is out. Dick Taverne has been beaten by Margaret Jackson on a return match.
Margaret Jackson, a Labour Party research assistant, political advisor to Judith Hart.
Have a little bit of order till I give you the results. I'll give it again. Dick Taverne, 13,714 votes. I therefore declare... Oh, wait a minute. I therefore declare that Margaret Mary Jackson is duly elected to serve as a Member of Parliament for the constituency of Lincoln.
And that may be the end of Dick Taverne's social democratic dream, as Margaret Jackson, a research assistant at Central Office and now an assistant to Judith Hart, the Ministers of Overseas Development, takes the seat back after 2 elections.
Beating him by almost 1,000 votes in a replay of a very close 3-cornered race last February.
So that is one of the Mavericks down tonight, and we wait to hear from Eddie Milne in Blyth, of course, and also Chris Mayhew down in West Country at Bath. And there's a very happy indeed Margaret Jackson. A result from London now, from Romford, a Conservative seat, and being held by Michael Newbert.
And almost no swing. This is one seat that Labour might have helped to win. It was certainly on the margin. If there'd been a Labour landslide, it would have gone. But the Liberal vote collapsed there, went down by 8%, dividing almost exactly evenly between Conservative and Labour. So Mr. Newbert's majority has hardly changed from last time. Turnout down 8%.
And here's the confirmation of Wolverhampton North East. Renee Short's success. Renee Short on the left wing of Labour's national executive, and a clear swing to her.
A 3% swing in our first Midlands result. National Front, our first National Front result, only 4% of the vote, lost deposit.
And here's the Accrington result, a safe Labour seat.
Another National Front lost deposit. The Liberals just saved their deposit, and a swing to Labour, 2%. Rather low for a safe seat on tonight's form.
Of course, we must expect, as you were saying, David, quite a few lost deposits tonight. With the National Front running 90 candidates, they may be figuring rather high in it. And here's the result from Lincoln, the first Labour gain of the night, taking back a seat which Labour had when Dick de Verne was an official member of the Labour Party, Margaret Jackson's
The
success.
remarkable thing, in a way, is that Dick de Verne kept up his percentage of the vote. He only dropped 1% from last time, but the Tories dropped and Labour vote jumped to a quite clear victory.
And now time for the result in Wolverhampton South West. Remember, this was Mr. Enoch Powell's old seat, and it's now gone to Mr. Nicholas Budgeon as the sitting Conservative member. Let's hear the result from there.
As returning officer for the constituency of Wolverhampton South West, I declare that the total number of votes given for each candidate at this election is as follows. Nicholas William Budgeon, 20,854. Garth Anthony Cooper, 1,573. Ivan Ernest Giffin,
Labour,
15,554. Joseph Abraham Werner, 9,215. I declare that Nicholas William Budgeon is duly elected as Member of Parliament for the said constituency.
And that, of course, is not in any sense a surprise, although it seems to me there's a swing against the Conservatives.
Only a 1% swing, 1.2% swing.
And there is the full result. Mr. Nicholas Budgeon, a barrister, holding on to Mr. Enoch Powell's old seat.
This is the first sitting Conservative result we've had with Labour in second place, and there the swing is low, and it may indicate we're going to get low swings where you've got incumbent Conservatives, and the final outcome may be closer than the overall picture we're having at the moment of about a 2% swing between Conservative and Labour with 15 results in.
I think it makes the Scottish results more important than ever, because if there is to be any great swing the SNP in Scotland, this could create problems for Labour. I entirely agree that at the moment Labour are favourites to have an overall majority, although it could be cut back to largest party if they're cut into seriously by Scottish nationalists in Scotland.
And, of course, we haven't had a result from Scotland yet, although we have given the result of one opinion poll in Stirling, Falkirk and Grangemouth, which appeared to be better news for Labour in that they were holding that seat which the Scottish nationalists might have had some hopes of. But, of course, that's not an actual result yet, as we should stress. Now, we've had a number of results in here, with Labour 10 seats, Conservative 6. Graham, how do you predict it now? Is it too early for you?
No, I think we're about ready to say something about the sort of final result we might be homing in on. We're predicting at the moment that Labour will get 333 seats, Conservatives 263, Liberals 10 and others 29. But I must stress that those are our best predictions at this point. We can't be too certain about them. All we can be certain about is that the Labour Party is going to get at least 290, perhaps 295 seats. The Conservatives, on the other hand, are going to get at least 230, 240 seats. There's a big area of uncertainty in the middle, and it's too early yet to say anything very definite.
Well, that's a very becoming modesty, but at least Graham is still saying that there should be, on past experience, an overall Labour majority, but of course the events of the night will show. The victorious Tory in Cheltenham, Mr. Charles Irving, who is incidentally a member of the National Union of Journalists and therefore another Conservative trade unionist, he was pelted with eggs after the result. So it's been two kinds of a night for him. Let's try this result from Wickham. Sir John Hall, the sitting Conservative member, and in no difficulty in being returned.
A very low swing there. The Liberal vote goes down quite sharply. A National Front candidate comes in and gets 3.5% of the vote, but between Conservative and Labour, no great swing. We haven't had any significant swing to the Labour Party in Conservative-held seats or in the one near marginal we've had in Romford, which may be bad for the Conservatives next door, for the Labour Party's hopes next door of winning Upminster. So I think, you know, there's still more to make me queasy about projecting outwards from the safe results we've had. Virtually every seat we've had so far has been a safe seat, safe Conservative or safe Labour. I just want evidence from marginals. I also want evidence from Scotland before I start sticking my neck very far out.
Well, evidence that the Conservatives have held Solihull and Labour held Wolverhampton South East. These are two predictable results in the Midlands. Not yet the kind of evidence that David is looking for, or Bob. Well, if in fact the Labour lead is being cut down in practice on the ground, despite the very good results which Labour has had in Salford and in Rennie Short's seat, this may pose some problems. We had been supposing that we would go off the air at 4 o'clock this morning. There's a little while to go there, and we hope to give you some entertainment between now and then. We had also supposed we might, for the first time in several general elections, have a clear result to give you tomorrow morning. But who knows? We may yet have to soldier on for quite some time. And now here is the Solihull result, a very safe Conservative seat in the Birmingham area.
And there the Liberal vote has held up better than I think any result we've had so far. They're down 1.2%, the Labour Party's up 3%, the Conservatives are down 1.8%, the turnout down 6%. It seems to me the drop in turnout is fairly even right across the country, all parts of the country, much more even than the swing. It is down between 5 and 7%.
Now, this would be partly because the register is more out of date. Would it also be, you think, that the country is a bit apathetic?
I think there are... Well, one of the interesting things is it's so even, because you might think you get higher turnouts in marginals, and this may be going to be something that we shall see as the evening goes on. We've so far only had safe seats. But I'm sure about half that drop in turnout is purely technical. The register is older in October than it was in
Now, we have
February.
another recount at Rossendale, David, also in North West, also one of these Tory seats that would tip over.
Well, if you have two recounts in Rossendale, it means the majority is almost certainly under 500. And if the majority is under 500, then it means that the swing is under 1%.
Well, we will await these results. Obviously, these Conservative seats are hanging on pretty desperately there, but hanging on so far. Anyway, Bob?
Well, let's look at the state of the parties board again. I think this is the big story we've got to follow all evening. If you look across the top, now, Labour being ahead 11-8 now shouldn't in itself be taken to mean very much, because the big cities count ahead of the rural areas and so on, and Labour has to be well ahead on the night. You must look across to the right-hand top corner. That +1, which so far is a gain in Lincoln only from Dick Taverne, not a gain from the Conservatives, must turn into +17 and stay there, or go above that for Labour to have an overall majority, and it's moving a little but very slowly. And no change anywhere else so far, except, of course, others at the bottom, meaning the Taverne loss by a narrow majority to Labour. But that's the figure to watch. Top right-hand corner must be 17 by the time this game's over.
And with news of the recounts then at Nelson and Colne and at Rossendale, David Waddington for Conservative, Ronald Bray for Conservative, apparently going to a recount at any rate. Conservatives holding Hastings on the south coast, so I don't suppose they had any particular doubts about that. But with a real fight apparently developing in northwest England, there is still, I think if one may use the forbidden phrase of the night, a good deal to play for. And we will await now some of these key marginals coming up in a short while. But for the moment, on the results so far, we are still predicting a Labour overall majority. How big or how small remains to be seen. So, David, you still stick to an overall majority?
I stick to an overall majority, but very tentatively, because I just don't think we have had the evidence in from the types of seat in which the election is going to be decided. For what it's worth, on the 17 seats we've so far had, the Conservatives are down 1.7 in their share of the vote, Labour's up 2.2 in their share of the vote, the Liberals are down 0.9. They're actually down much more in the seats which they fought both times, but several of the seats so far tonight are seats they were intervening in.
Bob?
Remember that computer prediction of 329 is only 11 more than the 318 needed for a bare overall majority. So people have to keep in mind that 318 is what's the minimum required for an overall majority, and the computer is bound to have a certain margin of leeway for itself, and 329 is not a very healthy figure at this stage to be sure of an overall Labour majority.
Some Conservative results now from the south. And here's Thanet West. No, here we are, Thanet West. Just a moment there. William Rhys-Davies holding on to the seat quite safely.
Labour's pushed up into second place. They were pushed down into third place. There is a fairly big movement. The Conservatives down 4%, Labour up 5% there, Liberals down 1%.
And there it is, Mr. Rhys-Davies. He's a long-serving backbencher in the Conservative Party. Occasionally you see him at racecourses. But anyway, very distinctive figure. And no doubt comfortably relieved to be back in Thanet. Would have been a problem for him if it hadn't. Here's the Tunbridge Wells result. That is not Christopher Mayhew, who's fighting down in Bath. That is the Conservative, Mr. Mayhew, who has held Tunbridge Wells very
And the
very
Liberals,
comfortably.
the Conservative hold on to their vote. The Liberals are almost pushed into third place, but they do just hold on above Labour. There's about a 4% switch in votes between Liberal and Labour. Labour taking Liberal votes in these seats where the Liberals were doing so well last time.
And now Robin Day, I think, has an opportunity to talk to the vanquished Dick Taverne in Lincoln.
Good morning, Dick.
I can just hear you, not very clearly.
I can't hear what you're saying.
Sorry, there's a disturbance at the moment.
I can hear you now.
I can just...
Can you hear me?
Only just.
Dick, you got 13,714 votes, though you must be disappointed. That was probably better than you might have expected.
And also possibly worse than I might have.
And which is it?
Well, I think the answer is that there is obviously a national swing to Labour which helped the Labour candidate. And also, I think it was true that as an independent, it was more difficult each time to combat the party machines. But we fought a better campaign this time than last, and I thought we were in there with a pretty good chance.
Do you think you were damaged by that story about in August, about your alleged flirtation with the Liberals? Does that damage you?
I have no idea. I mean, this was a story which appeared while I was away, and I couldn't deal with it myself because I was abroad. But I don't think that's had any effect on it, no.
What do you think were you mainly up against? Loyalty to the party machine, back to the two-party system? Or
the most difficult argument I always had to meet was, well, we'd like to vote for you, but what can one man do? And this was a telling factor in the last election, and it obviously was one that became more telling as time went on.
What was your answer?
My answer was a very good one. First, that I could pioneer ideas, and I could say what other people weren't saying because they were looking over their shoulder. The second was that, in fact, if in an undecided parliament, I could obviously have considerable influence. And third, that I still expect to see at a certain stage a realignment of British politics, because it looks at the moment like a Labour government.
Dick, does it mean, sorry to interrupt you, but does it mean the end of your hopes for that realignment now? I mean, there's no sign now, if there's a working Labour majority, of your social democratic wing of the Labour Party as you would like to see it breaking away, is there?
No, I think we'll find that the government's going to face certain difficulties. I mean, it's going to face them over Europe, where there are very different views. It may face them over an incomes policy, which I suspect at some stage will re-emerge again. And I've no doubt that there will be conflicts between right and left, which will put a considerable strain on this coalition, which isn't always a very happy one inside the Labour Party itself.
What are your political plans now, Dick?
Well,
do you plan to join the Liberals or anything?
My political plans are hardly something I will decide at this moment. I shall have a good sleep on it and decide to wait for a little while before I make up my mind.
Thank you for talking to us. Alistair?
And Dick Taverne seeming there, smiling and apparently well satisfied that he has fought the good fight, taking some time to reconsider his position. It's only a short while ago, of course, almost, that we saw those dramatic pictures from Lincoln when he won back his own seat and indeed then tried to start his own party. It seems now to be in ruins. So that is the first of the Mavericks down tonight. And the state of the parties now at midnight, with Labour 11, Conservative 11, the one Labour gain. We've just seen the loser, Dick Taverne, at Lincoln. And this is what Labour is looking at now, given the national situation and the apparent national swing Labour's way. These are the seats that Labour hopes to pick up in the next few hours. Bury and Ratcliffe in the north, Ipswich in East Anglia, Northampton South in the Midlands, Nelson and Colne, where we know there's a recount going on, Bolton West, not very far away, Rossendale, another recount has been announced there, Southampton Test on the south coast, and Beeston. Well, now it's an interesting situation, Nelson and Colne and Rossendale, because the two hopeful Labour candidates there, Mr. Eric Hoyle and Mr. Michael Noble, are both members of Clive Jenkins's union, Astims. And Mr. Jenkins has put up a number of candidates in this election, not in safe seats, as some unions do, and so he must be keeping his fingers crossed to know whether he's going to get 2 MPs back in that part of Lancashire. I think a chance to go to Devon North, if we can now, Mr. Thorpe's seat and David Lomax.
Well, slightly more definite news for you here from the Queen's Hall, Barnstaple. As I hope you can see now, there's Mr. Jeremy Thorpe, and the other candidates also have now come along here to the final count. We now know that the turnout was 79.7%. That's a slight drop. In February it was 86.5%. And we're expecting the result around about 1:30 here at the Queen's Hall in Barnstaple. This is David Lomax in Devon North.
Well now, David, Mr. Thorpe looks very calm and quiet, almost resigned in the picture that we're seeing.
Yes, he's extremely bouncy, as his party workers admit. He's worked very furiously in the whole of this campaign, going all outside the constituency. Jovial and joking, as you can see, although some of his party workers do admit privately that they would not be surprised at all if his majority in February, that's 11,000 majority, were cut somewhat. They were saying privately the other day around about 7,000, they think. He only, of course, scraped in by 369 votes in 1970.
So that would really be a personal success, given the amount of campaigning that he's had to do for the very first time.
Yes, he has gone outside the constituency more, I think, than before. And I know that certain people at the top of the Liberal Party were hoping that he might go out a bit further.
Do you think the hovercraft ploy did him any good or any ill?
I beg your pardon?
The hovercraft that he used, do you think that did him any good for publicity, or did people just think it was a gimmick?
Well, it's a very difficult thing to say. I think some people thought it was a gimmick, definitely, yes.
Well, Mr. Thorpe was certainly one of the first of the party leaders to decide to go campaigning, and perhaps it was rather bad luck for him that the weather turned bad as early as it did, and his first hovercraft had to be written off. Normally, they managed to switch on the sun in an October election. I can't really say that Mr. Wilson has been able to do that this time. However, there may still be some sunshine in the results for him. Let's have one or two results. Here's Surbiton, Sir Nigel Fisher, who is much on the left wing of the Conservative Party and an admirer of the late Ian MacLeod. He's had a little bit of difficulty with right-wingers in his seat, but he's back there.
Not much change there, but in fact the Liberals are pushed into third place. This is going to be the story of the night, I think, in quite a lot of the South East. The Liberals are pushed into third place with a sort of 1.5% switch between them and Labour.
Bob?
Another part of the story of the night is the opinion polls haven't done very well again, because every poll of the 5 produced today, including our own, would certainly point to a much more substantial swing to Labour than is actually occurring. Therefore, it's just worth noting in passing that the polls are having a bad night, among other things.
And let's have a look now at the Wolverhampton South East result. I'm getting the morning papers in, but they are rather further behind than we are. Here's Wolverhampton South East. This is Bob Edwards, the former General Secretary of the old Chemical Workers Union. This has always been his seat.
Just about average swing to Labour in the Midlands.
And a result from the South Coast, a safe Conservative seat, Liberal coming rather bad third.
Yes, and again, 2% swing, actually it's rather a high swing to Labour for a safe Conservative seat on the pattern of the 20-odd results we've had so far tonight.
And the results flow should be picking up shortly, although whether they're going to be the results that we really want to know, well, that's a matter. The papers are still saying it's the most vital vote of all, machine guns guard Enoch, and so on. And let's have a word now and see how things are going in Birmingham, where there are a number of marginal seats there and thereabouts. To Birmingham.
We're going ahead now? Ready when you are, John.
Tony Francis is in Birmingham. I think we're just going to get the results.
Can we have quiet, please, for a moment? The Ladywood constituency today, and the result is as follows. I, the undersigned being the acting returning officer for the constituency above mentioned, hereby give notice that the total number of votes given for each candidate at the election was as follows. Hardeman Kenneth George,
Liberal,
3,086. Lorne Richard,
Conservative,
5,079. Walden Alistair Bryan,
Labour,
14,818, and that the undermentioned person has been duly elected to serve as member for the said constituency, Walden Alistair Bryan.
Well, one's heart skipped a beat for Brian Walden when the returning officer gave the wrong number of votes there, but it is, of course, a comfortable 14,000. Brian Walden, one of the most promising and able of the young Labour backbenchers who has not felt able to take office in Mr. Wilson's latest government.
A big swing to Labour. The Liberals just saved their deposit there.
And, there isn't a great deal to say. I want to thank all of those who have cooperated in the count, not merely the counters.
3.9.
And here we have the recount at Newcastle North. This is a Conservative seat, normally Conservative held, and we wonder what that recount is about. Who is bustling up whom, or who is trying to save a deposit?
It's a relatively marginal seat. I think the Conservatives could lose that on current form.
Well, they're holding on in some marginals.
Well, they are holding on. No, I'm not saying. I think that if it's a recount to see whether Mr. Elliott survives there.
And now I think Robin has got Edward Ducan down in Bristol. Mr. Ducan is the chairman of the Conservative 1922 committee. Robin?
Mr. Ducan, we haven't had your Taunton result yet, have we?
I'm doing my best to find out for you. I'm sorry to...
Are you through to me now, Robin?
Yes, I am. We're on the air.
I hear you. I don't hear you through this thing. Can I take it out of my ear? I hear you through the loudspeaker.
Oh, good. Well, I don't mind how you hear me, so long as you do.
Say what you were saying again, will you?
We haven't had your result in Taunton yet, have we?
You'll get that tomorrow about midday.
Thank you very much. What do you think of the result so far? It looks, on our prediction for what we're able to do, a Labour majority of around 20, but of course that could change either way. What do you think about that?
I haven't heard all the results because I've been driving up from Taunton to your studios in Bristol, but what I have heard, I've not found pleased me very much. It's disappointing that the Conservatives haven't won the election.
There's been a smaller swing nationally than some of the polls suggested. And the Liberals don't seem to have done very well. They seem to have dropped generally, but Labour seems to have got an overall working majority so far as we can see at the moment.
There are no surprises in that. I think everybody expected the polls to be proved wrong to some extent.
Now, we've just had a Labour gain at Nelson and Cone, which is one of the interesting marginals which we've been talking about here.
Yes, that's a sadness because there was a very fine sitting Conservative member. The House of Commons will be the poorer without him. I don't think anybody was surprised, however, to see the Liberals squeezed. I think most people regard them as an irrelevancy in the main political struggle.
Mr. Ducan, you've been critical of Mr. Heath's leadership in the past sometimes. Were you satisfied with the Conservative campaign this time? Was it on the right lines?
I've been a strong supporter of Mr. Heath, as you know, Robin.
I know you've been a supporter. I know you've been a supporter, but you have been critical.
Well, we haven't won the election. That's a disappointment to us all, but it's much too early to talk about who gets blamed for that. The whole Conservative Party, of course, has got to share the blame for the fact that we haven't won the election.
Did you fight on the National Unity ticket?
Rather. I fought also as a strong supporter of Mr. Heath and of Conservative policies.
Can Mr. Short hear me in Newcastle?
Yes, I can hear you.
Good morning, Mr. Short.
Good morning. How are you?
Very well indeed. What do you think of the prospect of the result, so far as we can see it at the moment? Is a 20 or 30 working majority, if that should be the figure, is that adequate for the...
Oh, indeed, yes.
Yes.
Yes, in the 64 to 66 government, we existed for, 18 months with a majority of 5 and then 3.
It looks as though the electorate doesn't like minority government. I mean, that's a clear vote in favour of majority government this election, isn't it, so far?
I think it is. It looks like that, and it looks as though the electorate don't like coalitions either.
The Liberals haven't done as well so far as they expected.
No, my opponent lost his deposit. Yeah. It looks as though they're down all over the place, doesn't it?
And we're just looking at the figures in your result again, Mr. Short. There was a 3% swing to you. Do you feel a little disappointed that the Labour result seems to be behind what the polls were saying, or presumably you're a wise old politician who doesn't trust the polls anyway?
Well, I never pay much attention to them, but I've been all around the country, and you get a sort of good idea of the feel of the thing, and it seemed to me to be that the polls were perhaps exaggerating it a bit.
Alistair? Thank you, gentlemen. I must leave you now. I've got to go back to Alistair Burnett. Thank you for joining us. Goodbye.
Just to give you the news, the full detail of that result at Nelson and Cone, the first Labour gain from Conservative tonight in Lancashire. Eric Hoyle, Labour, a sales engineer. He fought the seat in 1970 and again in February. Now he's taking David Waddington out, the Liberal losing a deposit.
Only 1% swing in that marginal seat. We need a slightly bigger swing than that in marginals for the Conservatives to win the election overall. There's a recount nearby there in Rossendale, which is a very similar seat, needs a slightly bigger swing to go.
But it's remarkable, in fact, that the Liberal vote there should have been halved in Nelson.
There's a big swing, much bigger swing in a safe seat in South Yorkshire.
And again in Lancashire, but a safe Labour seat.
And a considerable swing there. Oh, sorry, the considerable drop in the Liberal vote. The Labour gain is at the Liberals' expense there.
And into Manchester now, again, a pretty safe Labour seat.
It's a seat that was Conservative and went Labour at the last election with the aid of redistribution. The Liberals dropped 5% in their share of the vote. Labour goes up 5%.
Notice there the Irish civil rights candidate has not done well, has lost a deposit. That's been one of the problems for some Labour members. They've worried whether they would lose the Irish vote. Well, it doesn't amount to very much in Manchester Moss Side. And now a Conservative seat, Fred Sylvester's seat in Manchester Withington.
It's the only Conservative seat in Manchester and is likely to stay so for a while.
He, of course, has gone there from Walthamstow. And here's Michael Meacher, who's very strong on statistics about social security and so on in the Labour Party, holding his seat in Oldham West.
The swing is bigger in South Lancashire than in the north of Lancashire.
Very able young member. And now in Eccles, another safe Labour seat.
Liberal drop 3%, Labour gains 4%, Tories down 1%.
And here's one the Conservatives were worried about. This is Mr. John Loveridge in Upminster, and he's hung on with a very small swing.
This may be very comforting to the Conservatives because it's next door to Romford, where there was only a 0.2% swing, and if this is happening in marginals around London, where there are several to come, this may make a difference to our final prediction.
And here's Crewe. This is Mrs. Gwyneth Dunwoody, who has come here after she lost her seat down in Exeter. And she is the daughter of the late Morgan Phillips, the former General Secretary of the Labour Party. And we understand that Putney has been held by Labour. That's one that the Tories would have had their eyes on had there been any swing their way, and Barbara Castle holding Blackburn. So Barbara Castle, the darling of the left wing of the Labour Party for so long, though not always the darling of the trade unions when she tried to bring in some reform measures there, safely back in Blackburn, the seat that she's held through her political life. And with Geoffrey Howe, who's the Conservative expert on social security, as well as being a former Solicitor General back in his seat in Surrey East, Bob Mackenzie is standing on this very interesting battleground.
Well, this is the area where the parties, the two big parties, meet head-on. The battleground where their most marginal constituencies are listed on either side of the central line. Now, Labour is holding some of its important marginals. Keighley, for example, they've held. And Manchester Moss Side, which was unlikely really to go at all against them. But the first breakthrough, as between the two big parties, occurred here with Nelson and Cone being knocked off by Labour as one of the marginals which they were most eager to get. But on the other hand, remember, too, the Tories have held Upminster. Now, this suggests that it's unlikely you'll get a total nine-pin situation here. When the Tories can hold Upminster, they may be able to hold several others in this line as well. But here's where the battle now, from now on, will increasingly be fought. And the possibility of a real Labour majority depends on them getting somewhere over here most of these seats to be taken from the Conservatives in order to get a really secure majority. But remember also, if we may look for a moment at the Liberal takeoff problem. Remember we said last time and earlier in the week that the Liberal Party has to get up somewhere to around 28 or 30% of the vote before it really begins to collect any number of seats. And they are not so far managing to do that. Last time, with 20% of the vote, they got only 14 seats. A heartbreak for them, and so far tonight the evidence suggests that they're not getting near the takeoff that would give them the kind of big representation which their actual support in the country would have justified, certainly last time.
Just news, Bob, that there's a recount at Northampton South. This is the Conservative marginal in Northampton. And so it looks as if Labour has hopes there, but of course it's one that Mr. Wilson really did need to take if he's to get an overall majority. And David, how do you read that one?
Well, that one is again a majority in hundreds, and if it is being recounted, if it is possibly still in the Conservative column, it counts further doubt on things. I notice also one of the most marginal seats we're looking for is Ilford North, and that's next door to Romford and Upminster, both of which have had swings almost nothing. If they're repeated in Ilford North, the Conservatives would just hang on.
And Tony Crossland back at Grimsby. There he is. And it's good news for him. Of course, he's been there ever since he lost his seat down in the southwest. Here's Barbara Castle's result. This is Barbara Castle back in Blackburn.
Comfortable swing to Labour there. National Front gets 4% of the vote and loses their deposit. The Liberals lose their deposit too.
And there is the Tony Crossland result.
Once he only got in by 100 votes there. It's now moved into safe Labour seat. The Liberals drop 3.4% of the vote, still get 20%.
And here's Putney, Hugh Jenkins, the Minister for the Arts, holding on in a marginal.
A small swing to Labour in London. The swing is low in the London area.
Jerry Wade, a promising Tory candidate. He may get a better seat the next time round. And let's go now to Robin Day, who's talking to Mr. Reggie Maudling and Mr. David Steele.
David Steele, what do you think about the figures for the Liberals so far? It does seem to be rather as if the electorate on the results so far have said, we don't like minority government, we're going to have majority government.
I think it's a little early to deduce that. I think what is significant is that we haven't yet had a result either from a Liberal-held seat or indeed one of the seats that we'd any hopes of winning. And it does seem to me that there is a wide variation in the swing and the movement of electors from one party to another as between the marginal seats and the safe seats. I would agree with you that in the seats so far, none of which have been seats that the Liberals could hope to win, we appear to have dropped back in our share of the poll. But of course, if the overall polls were right, and I don't know whether they were, this must conversely mean that we should hope to be up a bit in the seats where we are doing well. I just don't know, I think, at this stage.
Mr. Maudling, how do you read the situation, or do you think it's too early to make any intelligent comments?
I'll try. I think it's better than the opinion poll said it would be, from our point of view. It does appear to be a difference in the swing between the north and the south. A little worried about this. Don't want the country dividing between different trends in one area or the other. Too soon, obviously, to make a firm prediction. But certainly nothing like as bad as I think I saw predicted on this programme about an hour or two ago.
No, they were wrapped around with saving clauses in the small print, which
social contracts.
They'll be saying later. But are you reconciled to a working Labour majority?
No, certainly not.
Do you think that events could make it closer?
Well, looking back to '64, for example, remembering the difference in the results on Thursday night and Friday morning, there's still a lot to go.
But knowing the difficulties as you know them as an ex-Chancellor, Mr. Maudling, do you think it's better to have a working Labour majority to take decisions, or to have a narrow result which is difficult, with, say, a 1 or 2 working majority?
No, it's certainly better to have a minority. If there has to be a Labour government, to have a minority one, which can stop them doing the stupid things they might otherwise do if they have a majority.
Yeah. If there should be a vacancy in the leadership of the Conservative Party as a result of this election, Mr. Maudling, would you be a candidate?
I don't see any such vacancy occurring.
David, what were you going to say?
Nothing. I was listening to you talking to Reggie Maudling.
Oh, well, I was... most people I interview on this programme are bubbling to add something else.
Well, I must say it's a change that you call me by my right name after last Tuesday.
Oh, I was very tired that night, and I had got 3 pictures on the monitor at once.
I was going to call you Mr. Dimbleby tonight in retaliation.
I'll send for Lord Goodman to send you a writ if you do that. What did I call you the other night?
You called me first Mr. Foot and then Mr. Heath, which I suppose is BBC Balance.
Oh, dear, I'm very sorry. What was your name again?
Steele.
We might talk to you again. Alistair?
Well, I think we've time perhaps to try and take some results which are in and add to the evidence of what is happening in the election. There's Joan Lester, left wing of the National Executive of the Labour Party, junior Foreign Office Minister, much opposed to the Lions tour of South Africa.
Part of this very steady swing in the South, somewhere between 0 and 2% in every seat we've had almost.
Also in the London suburbs, but a posher one, Norman Lamont back in the Boyd Carpenter seat at Kingston.
And the Liberals go down into third place.
Confirmation of Sir Geoffrey Howe, Shadow Minister, in his stronghold in East Surrey.
Liberals down 5%, Labour up 3%. Conservative share of the vote up there.
And here is Geoffrey Howe. He's one of the men who came to the front in the Conservative Party during the Heath government. He was promoted from Solicitor General to take over responsibility for prices, consumer affairs. And now another result. Plymouth Sutton, this is Alan Clark. He's the son of Lord Clark of Civilization fame.
And this is important because there's Plymouth Drake next door, which is a marginal seat, and on that swing I think it would just go to Labour.
Liverpool Edge Hill, Sir Arthur Irvine, who was once felt to be under some attack from the Liberals, and although David Alton has come second, no problem.
Increased share of the vote for the Liberals, and they stick to second place. This is the first case where they've been second to Labour in the results tonight, and it's one of the few cases where their share of the vote, I think the only case, where their share of the vote's gone up.
And here we come to another, this is Irving, not Irvine, in Dartford, a safe Labour seat.
And small swing to sort of London area swing to the Labour Party.
And Andrew Bennett, a man who just took over this seat, and it was a marginal. At any move to the Conservative, it would have fallen their way.
2%, slightly lower than average swing for that area in a marginal seat.
And we will get some more of these results. We're still waiting for the outcome of that recount at Rossendale, where Ronald Bray is the defending Conservative, Michael Noble for Labour. They're obviously going to have rather a difficult and tough evening. And still no sign of any other seat coming up, which there's Conservatives holding Shipley, that's Marcus Fox. Let's have a look at Holborn and St Pancras South, Mrs. Lena Jaeger, who is a journalist.
Much the biggest swing to Labour we've had in a London seat there. Liberals just saved their deposit but dropped 4%.
And Chingford in northeast London, Norman Tebbit, the airline pilots champion.
A low swing to Labour there in north of London.
Manchester Openshaw, Labour safe seat. And with these results coming in rather a more satisfactory stream, not perhaps some of the most important ones for us yet, Graham Pyatt, how does your prediction look now?
Well, we've got 50 results in now, and the prediction for the Labour Party has come down slightly to 325, Conservatives 271, Liberal 10, others 29. But there's still a great deal of uncertainty. It is narrowing, and we can move the pointers in slightly, but a great gap of uncertainty remains. What we can be sure about is the Conservatives can't get the 318 seats that an overall majority on their side would require. We're also certain that Labour will be the biggest party in the new House of Commons. But we are not yet convinced that Labour will make the 318 seats to give it an overall majority. We think they will, but we are not certain that that will happen.
And news of Douglas Jay back in Battersea North. That's one of the most anti-common market members, now on the Labour backbenches. Indeed, he left Wilson government in the 1960s because he was opposed at that time to Mr. Wilson's negotiations with Europe. Now, we have the winner at the Lincoln result, Margaret Jackson, who defeated Dick Taverne. A very emotional moment for her. Paul Tibbenham asked her after the count how she felt about her victory.
Staggered, to tell you the truth.
What sort of campaign would you say it's been?
I think it's been a very hard-working campaign for everybody. On the whole, a very clean campaign. I went to great pains to fight the election on policy, both last time and this time. And I'm glad I did, because in the end I think it's paid off.
But how do you explain, at one time, Taverne's majority of 13,000 just dwindling away like that?
Well, I think that's basically why it dwindled away, because people began to see that having an independent MP wasn't relevant to the enormous problems that we faced as a country. And I think we tried hard to convince them that what they needed was a Labour government, and we succeeded.
And what sort of questions were people asking you during the 3 weeks?
Oh, all about policy, about inflation, about the social contract, that kind of thing, always. A little about coalition, but basically about the problems the country was facing.
Because you were handicapped, weren't you, during the campaign by having the flu for
Yes.
the first part of it?
Yes.
Do you think that had any effect at all?
Well, it had an effect, obviously, in that I wasn't able to do all the canvassing and so on that I did last time. But we managed, apart from one day, to avoid cancelling any of my meetings. I did all of those. I think it meant that it was a less easy campaign for me, but it wasn't too bad.
Do you think this means that in the long run, a single person can't actually stand against a big party machine?
I think it depends on what the single person stands for.
Congratulations. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Rather poor news for the Liberals that in Leeds West, which is one of their shots to get a seat from Labour, Mr. Joseph Dean has held that seat. Let's go to Sutton and Cheam.
Given for each candidate at this election is as follows. Crowell, Una Margaret Patricia,
Women's Rights,
298. McFarlane, David Neal, 22,156.
Conservative.
Rhodes, James Kenneth, 7,118.
Labour.
Tope, Graham Norman, 16,995.
Liberal.
And I therefore declare David Neal McFarlane duly elected as a Member of Parliament for the Sutton and Cheam constituency.
And a serious reverse for the Liberals in Sutton and Cheam, Graham Tope failing to regain the seat, and Neil McFarlane, the Conservative, holding the seat which he recovered for the Conservatives in February.
A 6% drop in the vote for the Liberal Party there, 2% up for the Conservatives, 2.5% up for Labour. The women's rights candidate, Dr. Crowell, only getting 0.6% of the vote. Now, this is a disappointment on top of the Leeds West one, which is the only Labour-held seat they had serious hopes of.
Determine any particular action at this moment, but I must express my gratitude to all my workers who have worked so unavailingly over the last 3 or 4 weeks to make this increase in our victory possible. But I think everybody in all parties...
And news that Labour have held Paddington, that was one of their marginals in the middle of London, Arthur Latham back there. Also good news for Labour at Plymouth Devonport, a marginal in Plymouth, Dr. David Owen, who's a junior social services minister. He is back in that marginal. So there's no indication of any push towards the Conservatives in these seats. On the other hand, as we saw there in Sutton and Cheam, the Conservatives do seem to be seeing the Liberal Party off, and I would have thought, David, that that Sutton result made it rather difficult for the Liberals, if opinion is much the same in these London suburbs, made it difficult for them, say, in Richmond and Orpington.
I think it's very disappointing for them if they are hoping to win seats in the London area. I think their hopes now must rest in the West Country. We haven't had real news from there except from the urban Plymouth.
Let's have a look at some more results. And here we have Manchester Wythenshawe, Oldham East and Manchester Ardwick, all safe Labour seats.
Above average swings there, but they are safe seats.
Now, Bob, how's the share of the vote turning out?
Well, in a very different way from what you would expect if you took the public opinion polls very seriously. Let's say that again, that the extraordinary run of polls showing a 10% or other lead up to 12, 14% for Labour is not being reflected. Here's what actually has happened so far. Now, this is the share of the vote in the first 65, now 66 seats. This is the share across the top line. Read across if you would. Labour 43, Conservative 35, Liberals 19, others 1.3. Now, this is what is happening.
And with the news, sorry to interrupt you, Bob, Labour capturing Rossendale. That's another seat to go to them in the northwest. Mr. Wilson is at Huyton, and this is obviously good news for him. He is smiling. The seats are beginning to tip his way, though that nagging doubt must remain, as Bob Mackenzie was saying. The opinion polls may not be accurate, may not be giving him that clear overall majority, which we thought we could hand to him earlier on this evening. Now, Michael, you close to a result at Huyton, and how do you think the Prime Minister feels like?
Well, he doesn't look quite as confident to me at this moment. He must be a little disturbed, I would have thought, at the way this uncertainty still hangs over his efforts in the last few months. At this moment, here he is with his agent here, Mr. Arthur Smith, and in front of this luxuriant forest which decorates the scaffold, calling it that, the platform on which the decoration of the pole will be made. But that's some distance off, I would think, at the moment. It's almost a mechanical formality, this, from Mr. Wilson personally. I mean, the returning officer is hardly quivering with excitement or anticipation here, because he's returned Mr. Wilson at every election since 1959 here. And there's no doubt that Mr. Wilson is going to win this seat. He's held it with huge majorities for the past 24 years. Anyway, at some distance off here, we'll keep an eye on it and come back as soon as the poll's about to be declared.
Well, Mr. Wilson, of course, has always wound up his campaigns in Liverpool and, of course, been present at his own count at Huyton. Sometimes he stayed at the Adelphi Hotel in the middle of Liverpool. Last time he came back to London in a small aeroplane. I don't think then he was really sure that he was going to be able to form an administration which could carry on successfully for any length of time. Other occasions he's come back from Liverpool, back of a car in 1970 when he was surprisingly defeated, other times by train. We await to see what Mr. Wilson's travel arrangements are going to be as he returns from Huyton. And we still do await at 1:45, just after 1:45, whether in fact he's going to be able to form a Labour government with an overall majority. That's still what the prediction suggests, but of course we're having to say this without having any results yet from Scotland, which could influence what is happening and could very well cause trouble if, in fact, the Scottish nationalists run as well as some of the opinion polls, however discredited in one way or the other, have been saying. Well, now, Bob, we had to interrupt you there just to go up and see what the temperature was with Mr. Wilson, the share of the vote again.
Yes, let's, before we look at it, though, be clear what we're now saying. We're saying first of all that there is now no possibility of a majority Conservative government. The issue is between a Labour minority government and, I think more probably, Labour with a small majority, far less than all the opinion polls would have implied. But let's see how the vote's been split among the parties so far again. This is the share of the vote in the constituencies so far declared, 72 of them. Labour with 44.6%, which is up. If you look right beneath that, you'll see up 3.3%. The Conservatives have lost 1.2%, if you look across the second line. The Liberals have lost 2.1% of the vote in these constituencies. This is the way the votes shared out in the first 74 results. Alistair.
And we have the confirmation of the Rossendale result after the recount there. This was one which we have. This is one of the ones which tipped over. And there's Mr. Michael Noble. No relation to the former Secretary of State for Scotland, the Conservative. He's a WEA tutor, and he's taken the seat from Ronald Bray, who had held it since 1970. I think we should go back to Michael Charlton again now to see if we have any more news from Huyton.
This is the town clerk, Mr. Wilgoose here, Mr. Donald Wilgoose, who's announced all Mr. Wilson's election victories since 1959. About to do his stuff. Mr. Wilson's will be the last name to be mentioned here in Huyton. He will be preceded by his Liberal and Conservative opponents. So there, in front of the electors at Huyton, which he's been returned to Westminster for 24 years now. Mr. Wilson with Mrs. Wilson and Mr. Wilgoose. And the result.
I'm now ready to declare the result of the parliamentary election held in the Huyton constituency today. I'm now ready to declare the result of the parliamentary election held in the Huyton constituency today. The return is signed by me, Donald Wilgoose. And the total number of votes given for each candidate at the election was as follows. Michael Paul Braham,
Liberal,
4,956 votes. William Peters,
Conservative,
15,517 votes. James Harold Wilson, 31,750 votes.
12 votes fewer for Mr. Wilson this time than last.
And I declare that the said James Harold Wilson has been duly elected to serve as a member for the Highton constituency.
Only 2% swing.
That is Mr. Wilson's result. But a long time to go, perhaps, before the uncertainties over the election as a whole are removed for him.
Mr. Mayor, Mr. Returning Officer, it is my privilege now to move on behalf of all of us a vote of thanks to the Returning Officer and all his staff, and to say that we have seen yet again, under Mr. Wilgoose, all the customary efficiency which we associate with his conduct of a general election. Not only that, but his unfailing courtesy to all participants in the election, not only tonight, but from the moment the election was proclaimed. I should like to associate with this vote of thanks his staff, who have worked indefatigably tonight, and indeed many of them have had to right through the campaign. It has been a rather short election, which is the pattern, at least in 1974. I'm sure that's applauded by the whole country. We don't want elections to go on too long, but that has meant much more work for the Returning Officer and his staff. I should also like to include in this vote of thanks the police of this area, who have had a great deal of difficulty, a lot of problems, not in any way through the conduct of the electorate, but because they have had so much work to do in relation to policing the count. I've probably caused them a bit of trouble from time to time, and I want to say to Chief Superintendent Watson and all his staff how much all of us, I'm sure I speak for all the candidates, appreciate the quiet, efficient and discreet work that they have done. Naturally, I am gratified that on a smaller poll there has been a slight, just measurable increase in my majority. I think these things in any constituency are partly affected by national considerations, but especially in Highton, and I have no doubt that Councillor Peters will want to say the same thing, and with equal sincerity, but also these results are affected, and in this case, so far as I'm concerned, created by the hard and unremitting work by my supporters here in Highton. It has been a clean fight. It has been a fight about the great issues in the election. It has not been a fight about personalities. And I believe that that, in the main, has been true of the national campaign. Whatever differences there are between us, between the main parties, between all the parties, here in Highton and nationally, this election has shown, I think, one important fact of vital concern to our country, that all parties, and I believe the country itself, have agreed on the gravity of the crisis the nation is facing and has been facing now for this past year. However much we may, in our democratic way, disagree about the policies put forward by one party or another, and indeed the ministerial teams, or shadow ministerial teams, put forward by one party or another. We may disagree about the means which are necessary and right and appropriate for defeating this national crisis and bringing the nation through to a more secure future. But I think we are determined that once this election is over, and in a very real sense, it began, roughly speaking, at the time of the last declaration of the count, here and elsewhere. Once it is over, we all have a job, by whatever means we feel is right, to unite the country to fight this crisis. So again, Mr. Returning Officer, and ladies and gentlemen of his staff, I have pleasure in moving this vote of thanks in full confidence that it will be supported by my fellow candidates.
Mr. Wilson, after the declaration of his own result at Highton, speaking in prime ministerial tones.
Officer, ladies and gentlemen.
And as Michael Charlton was saying there, Mr. Wilson speaking in prime ministerial tones and making an appeal, moderate and restrained, for national unity. We should point out that the correction which we make there, a very surprising suggestion which we made during the course of those fast few minutes, that the Conservatives had lost Darwin. That would have been a very big surprise. Mr. Charles Fletcher Cook has held that seat since 1951.
It would have needed an 8% swing. I didn't believe it when I saw it. I was very pleased to see the correction.
We're glad to be able to correct that one now. We are waiting, of course. We were rather hopeful of getting Mr. Jeremy Thorpe's result in North Devon. And meanwhile, most of the results have been going pretty well according to pattern.
Labour have held Anglesey. I think that's our first Welsh result. And if the Welsh Nationalists were making a really big breakthrough, I think it was about 4th or 5th on their list.
Mr. Cledwyn Hughes's seat there in Anglesey. And the Nationalists in Wales, as you say, David, they haven't got many opportunities, and that's one that's lost. And here we have Labour taking Oxford. Now, that looks like Evan Luard, who he and Monty Woodhouse, Christopher Woodhouse, the Conservative, fight like Tweedledum and Tweedledee, and this time it seems to be Luard's turn.
Yes, there was a large crowd when I voted there this morning myself in Oxford, and it certainly is. It's one of those marginals that needed a 1% swing to go. It has gone, and the swing is low in these marginals. I think it's, you know, we are absolutely on the borderline. I think Labour is going to make it by a reasonable, 5 or 6 seat margin probably, but it certainly isn't final that they're going to get a clear majority.
And as you were saying a moment ago, David, there's a recount now at Plymouth Drake, given the results nearby, so that's a possible one that could go.
It certainly is.
And of course we have
Rochester and Chatham has gone to Labour. I understand that was Peggy Fenner's seat, former Conservative junior minister. That's one that Labour had to pick up too, if Mr Wilson is to get this majority.
Yes, now that is, I think those two things really move it quite a lot more Labour's way, the feel of the night. We are talking really about 20 seats that we're really watching for now. In a minute we have 2 of them, both going Labour.
Well, let's look at the Labour gains so far tonight. And we have them. Lincoln, that's from Dick Taverne, the Social Democrat. The others are from the Conservatives. Nelson and Cone, Rossendale, Oxford, which we've just heard from, and now, very lately, Rochester and Chatham, down in the Thames Valley. Sorry, the mouth of the Thames, I should have said. So these are Conservatives holding Chislehurst. Well, that's one that's been on the margin in the past, but given the way the Conservatives have been running in the South London suburbs, that perhaps is not too much of a surprise. Here's some London results. Kenneth Baker holding St Marylebone, Christopher Tugendhat, the City of London, and Westminster South, and also there's a Labour return from Tooting.
Bigger swings in inner London than in outer London.
And here is the Labour gain in Rochester and Chatham.
And this is in the squeeze of the Liberal vote. They go down 8%. They go down almost a third, and the Labour Party jumps 6%. The Conservative vote actually goes up very slightly in the seat they lose.
Well, Robert Bean's success there. He's a member of the Chatham Council. And he's a lecturer. He's the new Labour candidate in the seat, and he's taken it at first shot from a former Conservative spokesman on prices. Here's the result from Oxford. There's Evan Luard. He, of course, also at the university, very interested indeed in the law of the sea, Evan Luard. I think he's got a book coming out about it now, and he's just pipped his old rival, Monty Woodhouse, on the post.
And with the collapse of the Liberal vote, down 6% there. And
we should make it clear that Mrs Butler is not a relative of yours.
No relative of mine. The vote is down 8% there. It's a university seat. And the undergraduates were just coming back to Oxford today. The turnout was down with people leaving the university or not coming back in time to vote.
And here are some further results from Salisbury. Bristol North East, that's Mr Palmer, who's very interested in scientific and technological matters, and in Bristol South.
The notable thing there is in Salisbury, where the Liberal share of the vote, which you can't see, went up. It's about the first case of the Liberal vote going up.
And in Tottenham, Norman Atkinson, one of the leaders of the left-wing Tribunite group in the House of Commons, safely back. Brian McGee, philosopher, former TV personality. In Leighton and in St Pancras North, Mr Stallard.
Higher than average swing in safe Labour seats.
And here we have some more reasonably safe seats in Walthamstow for Labour, Hayes and Harlington for Labour, and Chislehurst remaining Conservative. And I think we have a possibility now of getting the result at Birmingham Stetchford, which of course is the seat of Mr Roy Jenkins, the Home Secretary. Let's go there.
And here at Birmingham Stetchford, the Lord Mayor, Councillor Eric Eames, is just about to declare the result.
I have here this result of the Stetchford constituency in the parliamentary election. I, the undersigned, being the acting returning officer for the constituency above named, hereby give notice that the total number of votes given for each candidate at the election was as follows. Jenkins Roy Harris, 23,075. Wedgwood David John, 11,152. Gopsill Graham, 5,860. And that the undermentioned person, having been duly elected to serve as member for the said constituency, Roy Harris Jenkins.
Smiling Mr. Roy Jenkins, the Home Secretary, back, no doubt expecting a further term of office, but before him the problem of Europe and the memories of his past divisions with Mr. Wilson.
The 9th time in this constituency to propose a vote of thanks to you, my Lord Mayor, and those who have assisted you in carrying out this election. And I do so with great pleasure. You have conducted the election, as always, with courtesy, fairness, and efficiency. We don't rush to bring our results out the first, but we don't wait until the middle of the night. We do it with a calm, solid consistency. And indeed, there is a certain consistency about the position, because we have 3 candidates here.
From Mr. Roy Jenkins, the Home Secretary, to Mr. Robert Carr's declaration at Carshalton, a former Conservative Home Secretary.
Returning officer, the Mayor of Sutton, Councillor Dennis Solari. He's been Mayor of Sutton for 2 years.
Solari, being the returning officer for the parliamentary constituency of Sutton Carshalton, hereby give notice that the total number of votes given for each candidate at this election is as follows. Atherton, Bernard Francis,
Labour,
18,840. Carr, Leonard Robert,
Conservative,
22,538. Smallbone, Hester Margaret Gatty,
Liberal,
8,272. And that Leonard Robert Carr has been duly elected to serve as Member of Parliament for this constituency.
Mr. Robert Carr's success at Carshalton. Now let's hear from Mr. Jeremy Thorpe's seat in North Devon.
Mr. Returning Officer, I would like, on behalf of all of us, to thank you, the staff, the counting officers tonight, those who man the polling station today, the police and everybody else involved on the admirable arrangements which have been made today. I would like, if I may, to congratulate my Labour opponent on having increased her vote, which I'm sure must give great pleasure to her supporters who have worked hard on her behalf, and I would like to thank all my supporters once again for returning me with a very comfortable majority. Thank you.
Mr. Jeremy Thorpe, quietly satisfied with his own result. Labour have taken Southampton Test. That's one that Labour had hoped to pick up with the swing going their way, but Conservatives have held on to Hampstead, Geoffrey Finsberg retaining his seat. David?
Well, that fits into the pattern we've been getting. The swing in the marginals is below the average. It's about 1.3 in the 9 marginals, the 9 Conservative-held marginals we've been having. That's just about what was on the simple thing. If it went everywhere, 1.3 to the Conservative, to the Labour Party, then they would be in, I think, with a majority of about 1. The computer seems to suggest, the people working the computer, it's going to be a little higher than that. But it is low in these marginals. We want to hear from them, and we haven't heard from a single Scottish seat yet.
Well, the news that the Conservatives have held Glasgow Gloucester, that's Peggy Oppenheim's seat. I think this is a chance to look at the battle. No, Bob is looking at the country as a whole. Bob?
Well, in one sense, the most striking fact is that with over a fifth of the results in, so little actual change has occurred. Granted, the predictions arising out of all kinds of guesses and opinion polls and so on. Now, this shows the 5 seats that we had up till Southampton Test, which Labour has picked up. 2 in the northwest, and therefore 2 Conservative losses, 1 in East Anglia, and 2 in the home counties area for Labour. That's 5 and Southampton Test to be put on in a moment on this chart. Now, you see how it looks on the battleground here, and it really is a battle, you know. Labour is holding all its intensively narrowly held marginals here and right across the board. All their rearguard position is okay, although we haven't yet got to Scotland. I don't know yet what damage might be done by the Scottish nationalists. Labour is breaking in here about what you'd expect for the kind of swing we're getting. They broke in at Nelson and Cone, Rosendale, Oxford, Rochester and Chatham, and Southampton Test. On the other hand, the Conservatives are holding Upminster, which means they're not being driven right out of this narrow range of marginals here. We just heard that Labour has picked up Ipswich, and therefore they're again within the 1% swing. They're picking up Ipswich now, we're told, and so that's the battle. The real battle's being fought there.